My name is Elias Nowak, demolition expert turned structural engineer. 4 days ago, nuclear missiles turned my world to ash. Then the ships appeared. I've survived the first 92 hours of this nuclear apocalypse by using what I know about how things break to keep myself alive. This is how I outlasted the initial blasts, radiation, and the things that came after. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I guess I should tell you a bit more about myself. Most people call me Fuse, nickname from my mining days when I specialized in controlled demolitions. I spent 15 years figuring out the precise way to break things down without damaging what needed to stay intact. Now I assess buildings and infrastructure for emergency response teams, determining what can be saved and what needs to come down. Funny how life works. I spent half my career learning how to tear things down safely, and the other half trying to keep them standing. That knowledge, understanding exactly how structures fail, is what kept me alive when everything else failed around me. I was at the Westbrook Dam that morning, 70 miles from my apartment in Cedar Rapids. The dam had been showing signs of stress after the heavy spring floods, and the State Emergency Management Office contracted me to assess the concrete integrity in the eastern spillway section. Pretty routine job, all things considered. That morning started like any other site visit. I arrived at 6, checked in with security, and began my inspection route along the maintenance passages. The dam was built in the 60s, solid construction but showing its age. Hairline fractures in the pressure-facing walls, water seepage in places that should have been dry. Nothing catastrophic, but the kind of things you monitor carefully. I always memorize the exit routes first thing when I enter any structure, something I've done since the mine collapse back in 2019. 3 guys didn't make it out that day because they didn't know there was a ventilation shaft 50 yards north of their position. I survived because I'd studied the layout blueprints during lunch breaks. After that, I never walk into a building without knowing at least 3 ways to get out. The dam had 7 emergency exits and 4 maintenance tunnels that ran deep into the earth beneath the structure. Those tunnels saved my life. I remember checking my phone that morning and seeing headlines about escalating tensions between major powers. Nothing new there. The world had been a powder keg for years. Nuclear posturing was practically a regular Tuesday at that point. I switched it off and focused on the concrete core samples I needed to collect. The main inspection took about 3 hours. I was documenting a concerning stress fracture in the eastern support column when my phone started buzzing. Not a call, but an emergency alert. Then another, and another. I pulled it out expecting a weather warning, maybe a flash flood advisory or a severe storm approaching. Instead, I saw the words that turned my blood to ice. Ballistic missile threat inbound. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. For a moment, I couldn't process it. My brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. I stood there 30 feet below ground level inside a massive concrete structure, staring at my phone as if it had started speaking in tongues. Then training kicked in. Not formal training, no one trains you for nuclear war, but the mental discipline that keeps demolition experts alive. Assess the situation, identify immediate threats, find the safest position, act without hesitation. I tried calling my sister in Minneapolis. No connection. I tried my ex-wife. Same result. Networks were already overwhelmed. I sent text messages to everyone in my contacts, knowing they might never go through. Then I focused on survival. The dam itself was sturdy, but it would also be a strategic target. Water, power, flood control, the kind of infrastructure that becomes invaluable after a catastrophic event. If missiles were targeting military and infrastructure, I needed to be somewhere else. I had about 20 minutes before the first impacts, based on the alerts. The maintenance tunnels extended nearly a quarter-mile into the hillside beside the dam. They housed backup generators, pumping equipment, and emergency supplies. They were also built to withstand catastrophic dam failure, which meant reinforced concrete at least 8 feet thick. I grabbed my backpack with my inspection gear, filled my water bottle at the drinking fountain, and headed for the deepest section of the tunnels. As I moved, I mentally inventoried what I had: multi-tool, flashlight, battery pack, first aid kit, protein bars, water filter, and tablet with structural blueprints of the dam. Not ideal for long-term survival, but better than nothing. The emergency lighting kicked on as I made my way deeper into the maintenance tunnels. Must have been automatic. Perhaps the main power was already affected. I found the control room for the auxiliary pumping systems, which had the advantage of being the deepest point in the structure, surrounded by massive concrete walls and earth on all sides. As I sealed the heavy door behind me, my watch showed 11:23 in the morning. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, and waited. The first blast came 17 minutes later. Even through tons of concrete and earth, I felt it. Not as sound, but as pressure. A sudden compression in my ears and sinuses, like diving too deep too quickly. The emergency lights flickered but stayed on. I felt the vibration through the floor and walls. A deep, subsonic rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Riverton. Had to be. It was the nearest city to the dam, about 20 miles east. Home to 40,000 people. Gone in an instant. The second blast came minutes later. Further away, judging by the reduced intensity of the pressure wave, then a third, and a fourth. I lost count after that. The dam structure held, but I felt it groaning around me, like a living thing in pain. I don't know how long I sat there in that control room, listening to the world end. Hours, probably. When things seemed to stabilize, I ventured back up the tunnel to try to get radio reception. The emergency broadcast system was still functioning, though the signal was weak and filled with static. The news was what you'd expect. Full-scale nuclear exchange. Major cities across the country hit first, then military installations, then strategic infrastructure. The broadcaster's voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the terror underneath. I returned to the control room and took stock. The room had emergency rations, enough for maybe 3 days if I was careful. There was a hand-crank emergency radio, first aid supplies, and, most importantly, a radiation detection kit. Standard equipment for dam operations, given the catastrophic potential of dam failures. That first night was the longest of my life. The emergency lights provided just enough illumination to see, casting everything in a pale blue glow. I tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw nuclear fire and thought about my sister in Minneapolis, about my colleagues, my neighbors, the barista who knew my coffee order by heart. By morning, if you can call it that since I had no way to see outside, I had developed a routine. Check radiation levels near the tunnel entrance. Scan radio frequencies for information. Ration food and water. Inspect the tunnel structure for signs of stress or failure. Repeat. The radiation readings near the entrance were elevated but not immediately lethal. Whatever hit Riverton must have been a tactical rather than strategic warhead. Small blessing, I suppose. The radio broadcasts became increasingly scattered and desperate, different military commands trying to establish contact with surviving units. Emergency management attempting to coordinate responses, civilians looking for information or help. I started keeping a log of blast reports, trying to map out which areas had been hit and which might be intact. Minneapolis was gone. Chicago, too. Most major cities, from what I could piece together. The broadcasts mentioned fallout patterns, advised people to stay sheltered, to wait for official evacuation orders that would likely never come. On the second day, I ventured further up the tunnels almost to the entrance. The radiation detector showed higher readings, but still within survivable limits for brief exposure. I didn't go outside, wasn't ready to see it yet. The radio told a fragmented story. Confusion about who had launched first, accusations between surviving government elements, reports of massive civilian casualties, infrastructure collapse, then something new, reports of atmospheric anomalies over several regions, unusual electromagnetic interference, unidentified aircraft not matching known military profiles. At first, I thought it was confusion, traumatized survivors seeing things or equipment malfunctioning due to EMP effects. But the reports became more frequent, more consistent. Multiple independent sources describing the same phenomena. By the third day, the broadcasts had changed tone. Military channels that had been coordinating recovery efforts were now discussing defensive postures against an unknown aggressor. Civilian broadcasts warned people to stay hidden, to avoid open areas, to extinguish lights at night. Something else had happened, something beyond the nuclear exchange. I checked my supplies. I had enough for maybe one more day if I stretched it. The radiation readings near the entrance were gradually decreasing, still dangerous, but not immediately fatal. I would need to leave soon, either to find more supplies or to seek other survivors. That night, the third night in the tunnels, I heard something I couldn't explain. A humming sound, but not mechanical. It seemed to modulate, to shift in pitch and intensity in patterns that felt deliberate but not human. It lasted for perhaps 20 minutes, then stopped. The emergency radio picked up fewer broadcasts the next morning. Those that remained spoke of contact and incursion. One military channel, breaking through briefly before dissolving into static, mentioned craft of unknown origin and ground forces deployed in Sector 7. I knew then that I needed to see for myself. The world above had changed in ways the broadcasts couldn't fully explain. Whatever was happening, hiding in the tunnels wouldn't keep me safe forever. I gathered my gear, checked the radiation detector one last time, and prepared to emerge. I had no idea what I would find, but staying meant certain death once supplies ran out. Better to face the unknown than waste away in the dark. As I approached the tunnel entrance, I noticed something odd. The emergency lights, which had been a consistent pale blue for 3 days, now had a greenish tinge. At first I thought it was my eyes playing tricks after days in artificial light. But as I got closer to the entrance, the effect intensified. I reached the heavy metal door that separated the maintenance tunnels from the outside world. I paused, hand on the release lever, suddenly afraid of what might be waiting. I thought about the mine collapse again, how we'd been trapped in darkness, how the world outside had changed in our absence, how nothing was the same after we emerged. I took a deep breath, turned the lever, and pushed the door open. The first thing that hit me wasn't radiation, but the light. After 3 days in the tunnels with nothing but emergency lighting, even the filtered sunlight was blinding. I shielded my eyes and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The sky wasn't blue anymore. It wasn't the ash gray I'd expected either. It was something else entirely, a sickly green tinge overlaying everything, like looking through algae-covered glass. This wasn't nuclear winter. This was something different. But let me back up. I need to tell you about those emergency broadcasts that first day before I lost myself in the tunnels. I was studying that stress fracture in the eastern support column, documenting the width and direction of the crack, when my phone started vibrating continuously. One emergency alert after another. At first, I thought it must be a mistake. Maybe a technician hit the wrong button at the emergency management center. It had happened before. False alarms about incoming missiles that sent people panicking into shelters. But this was different. Multiple alerts, all saying the same thing. Ballistic missile threat inbound. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. I tried calling my sister in Minneapolis first. 25 miles from Riverton, but worlds away in terms of population density. 1 million people in the metro area. The call wouldn't connect. Network congestion. I tried texting instead. Emergency alert. Missiles incoming. Get to basement now. Love you. I don't know if she ever got it. Next, I tried my ex-wife in Chicago. Same result. Networks were already collapsing under the volume of panic calls. I sent text messages to everyone I could think of, knowing they had maybe 15 minutes to find shelter, if that. Then I focused on my own survival. The damn control room had a television that was showing emergency broadcasts. The announcer's face was ashen, reading from a sheet of paper with trembling hands. Multiple ICBM launches detected from sites across Europe and Asia. Impact expected within 15 to 20 minutes in the following areas: Washington, D.C., New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle, Dallas, Atlanta, Miami, Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, Minneapolis, St. Paul, ... The list went on. First strike was targeting population centers. Tactical nukes would follow, targeting military installations. Then infrastructure, the dam. They would target the dam. I didn't have much time. The main control room was too exposed, all glass windows facing the reservoir. The administrative offices were above ground, vulnerable. The maintenance tunnels were my best chance. As I moved deeper into the complex, I tried to stay calm by focusing on structural details. 8-foot reinforced concrete walls, steel-reinforced support columns every 20 feet, emergency water and electrical systems independent from the main grid. If any place could withstand what was coming, it was here. I passed 2 maintenance workers heading up towards the main level. They hadn't received the alerts yet. I grabbed one by the arm and showed him my phone screen. Nuclear strike, 15 minutes. Get down to the auxiliary pump room now. He stared at me like I was insane. His colleague pulled out his own phone, saw the same alerts, and went pale. "Oh God, my kids are in school," he said. "There's no time," I told him. "You can't reach them. Best thing you can do now is survive." It sounds cold, saying it out loud like this, but that's the calculus of disaster. You focus on what you can control, not what you can't. I learned that in the mines. They followed me down to the pump room. We sealed the heavy blast door behind us just as the emergency sirens began wailing throughout the dam complex. The automated system had finally caught up with reality. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then came the first impact. Even through all that concrete and earth, we felt it. A vibration so deep it seemed to come from inside our own bodies. The emergency lights flickered. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. One of the maintenance workers, his name badge said Carlos, started praying quietly. The other one, Tom, just stared at his phone, trying repeatedly to call someone who would never answer. The second blast was further away. Then the third. After that, they started coming so quickly we couldn't distinguish individual impacts. Just a continuous rolling vibration, like sitting inside a giant drum while someone pounds on it from the outside. When the immediate barrage seemed to stop, I used my access card to check the dam's monitoring systems from a terminal in the pump room. The main structure was intact, but there were pressure anomalies in the reservoir. Something had changed the water level or flow pattern. Maybe a nearby impact had caused earth displacement or debris had blocked one of the tributary rivers. The emergency broadcast system was still operating on the terminal. We watched as a grim-faced military officer explained that a full-scale nuclear exchange was underway. He advised all civilians to remain sheltered, avoid exposure to fallout, and wait for further instructions that might never come. Carlos asked the question we were all thinking: how bad is it? The broadcast answered moments later as shaky footage from a military drone showed the Minneapolis skyline, or what remained of it. A massive crater where downtown had been, the blast radius extending for miles in every direction, nothing but rubble and smoke and fires that would burn for days. My sister lives, I have to believe, in a suburb 10 miles from downtown. Maybe she made it to a basement. Maybe the blast radius didn't quite reach that far. Maybe. The officer on screen was explaining fallout patterns now. The upper atmosphere winds would carry radioactive particles east and south. We were west of Minneapolis, which gave us some protection, but radiation doesn't respect geography. It would reach us eventually. Tom finally put down his phone. "My wife works downtown Chicago," he said flatly. "My kids were at school in Oak Park." I didn't know what to say. There's no comfort for that kind of loss. No words that make any difference. Carlos put a hand on Tom's shoulder and kept praying. The broadcasts continued through the night. Different announcers, different military personnel, but the same message: stay sheltered, avoid radiation, wait for help. The list of confirmed strikes grew longer with each update. It wasn't just the U.S. being hit. Europe, Asia, anywhere with strategic or economic significance. Nuclear winter was coming. The broadcasts explained what to expect. Temperatures dropping as smoke and ash blocked the sun. Disruption to weather patterns. Crop failures. Infrastructure collapse. But they also emphasized that this wasn't an extinction event. Humanity would survive. Governments were intact, operating from hardened bunkers. Military command structures were functioning. Recovery efforts would begin once radiation levels decreased. It sounded rehearsed, like they were reading from a Cold War playbook that no one ever expected to use. By morning, according to our watches, since we had no natural light, the immediate crisis had stabilized into a new, horrific normal. We took inventory of our supplies. The pump room had emergency rations, water, first aid equipment, and most importantly, radiation detection gear. Carlos decided to try to make his way home to his family in Lakeville, about 50 miles away. I advised against it. The radiation levels would be lethal above ground, but he was determined. Tom was in shock, barely responsive. He stayed with me in the tunnels. The second day brought new information through the emergency broadcasts, confirmation of which government leaders had survived. Preliminary casualty estimates in the hundreds of millions worldwide. Instructions for survivors about treating radiation sickness, finding clean water, avoiding contaminated areas. Then, late in the afternoon of the second day, the broadcasts changed tone. Military channels began reporting atmospheric anomalies over several regions. Unusual electromagnetic interference. Unidentified aircraft not corresponding to any known designs. At first I thought it was confusion. The chaos of nuclear war would naturally produce unreliable reports. Equipment damaged by EMP effects would malfunction. Traumatized survivors might see things that weren't there. But the reports kept coming, from different sources, all describing similar phenomena. I remembered my military service, how even in training exercises, communication discipline remained strict. These were trained observers reporting something they couldn't explain. By the third day, Tom had recovered enough to function. We established a routine, taking turns monitoring the broadcasts and checking radiation levels near the tunnel entrance. The readings were high, but gradually decreasing as heavier particles settled. The broadcasts were becoming more fragmented with longer periods of static or silence. Those that came through clearly now included coded messages we couldn't understand. Military units communicating in protocols established for worst-case scenarios. But between the coded transmissions, we caught disturbing fragments. References to craft of unknown origin. Instructions to avoid visual contact with non-military aircraft. Orders to maintain communications blackout when anomalous activity was detected. It wasn't just nuclear war anymore. Something else was happening. That night, our third in the tunnels, we heard it, not through the broadcasts, but through the concrete itself, a humming vibration, different from anything we'd felt during the nuclear strikes. It seemed to modulate in patterns, rising and falling in a way that felt deliberate. Tom looked at me, eyes wide. "What is that?" I didn't have an answer. The vibration continued for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The next morning, the broadcasts were fewer and further between. Those that remained spoke in increasingly guarded terms, references to contact situations and incursion zones. One military channel, breaking through briefly before dissolving into static, ordered all units to engage hostiles only when directly threatened, and to prioritize observation and intelligence gathering. Tom and I looked at each other, understanding without saying it. This wasn't just fallout from the nuclear exchange. Something else had entered the equation. We checked our supplies. We had maybe one more day of food if we stretched it. The water purification system was still working, drawing from the reservoir, but who knew how long that would last? We would need to leave soon, either to find more supplies or to seek other survivors. The radiation detector showed levels near the entrance had decreased enough to permit brief exposure. Still dangerous for extended periods, but not immediately lethal. We could leave if we had to. That afternoon, I made the decision. We would gather what supplies we could carry and head out the next morning. Staying meant certain death once food ran out. Better to face the unknown than waste away in the tunnels. Tom wasn't happy about it, but he understood the logic. We packed our bags with whatever might be useful. First aid supplies, water purification tablets, the radiation detector, emergency rations, flashlights, batteries, tools. That last night in the tunnels, neither of us slept much. The humming vibration returned, louder this time, lasting nearly an hour. The few emergency broadcasts we could pick up were now almost entirely in military code, but their tone conveyed urgency and alarm. Morning came, according to our watches. We checked the radiation levels one last time, still elevated but survivable for short periods. We would need to find better shelter within a few hours of exposure, but it was a risk we had to take. We approached the heavy metal door that separated the maintenance tunnels from the outside world. I put my hand on the release lever and looked at Tom. "Ready?" He nodded, though his face said otherwise. I turned the lever and pushed the door open. Light flooded in, not the harsh sunlight I expected, but something filtered and strange. As my eyes adjusted, I realized what I was seeing. The sky wasn't blue anymore. It wasn't the ash gray of nuclear winter either. It was tinged with an unnatural green, like looking through a piece of colored glass. This wasn't what I had expected. This was something else entirely. Tom stepped back, confusion and fear on his face. "What the hell is that?" I stepped forward into the changed world. The air smelled wrong, metallic and sharp, but not just from radiation. Something else was in it, something I couldn't identify. And there, on the horizon where Minneapolis should have been, was something that shouldn't exist. A massive shape hanging in the sky, too geometric to be a cloud, too still to be smoke, too alien to be anything human. I realized then that we had survived the first catastrophe only to face a second. The nuclear war wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I'll tell you about those first crucial days in the tunnels because what happened down there helped me understand what we were up against later. After that first barrage of nuclear strikes, when the immediate shaking stopped, Tom, Carlos, and I had to quickly adapt to our underground reality. The maintenance tunnels beneath Westbrook Dam weren't designed as fallout shelters, but they served well enough for our immediate needs. 8 feet of reinforced concrete between us and the radiation made a decent barrier. The auxiliary pump room became our base of operations. It had emergency power, climate control systems, and most importantly, access to the dam's monitoring equipment. I could check structural integrity, water levels, and even tap into emergency broadcasts through the terminal there. First priority was taking inventory of our supplies. The maintenance areas had emergency kits stationed at regular intervals, standard procedure for critical infrastructure like dams. We gathered everything we could find: emergency rations, water purification tablets, first aid supplies, flashlights, batteries, tools, and a hand crank emergency radio. Most valuable was the radiation detection kit, standard equipment for dam operations given the catastrophic potential of failures. I laid everything out methodically in the pump room, counting and calculating. We had enough food for about 3 days if we rationed carefully: protein bars, freeze-dried meals, and canned goods from the staff break room. Water wasn't an immediate concern since the filtration system was still operational, drawing directly from the reservoir. But power was another matter. The emergency generators were designed to run for 72 hours without refueling. After that, we'd lose climate control, monitoring systems, and water filtration. The emergency lighting would switch to battery backup, but that would only last another day at most. "How long do we need to stay down here?" Carlos asked, looking at our meager supplies. I showed him the radiation detection kit. "Depends on what these readings tell us. Fallout is worst in the first 48 hours. After that, it starts to decline. But we're talking about multiple detonations, so the patterns will be complex." That first night we established a rotation: 1 person monitoring broadcasts and dam systems, 1 person resting, 1 person checking tunnel integrity and radiation levels. None of us slept much. The emergency lights cast everything in a pale blue glow that made time feel suspended. The broadcasts painted a grim picture. Major cities across the country hit simultaneously. Military installations targeted in secondary strikes. Strategic infrastructure, power plants, dams, bridges, ports in the third wave. Government continuity protocols activated. Military command structures operating from hardened facilities. Emergency services overwhelmed. I sat at the terminal, mapping strike locations based on the reports. Minneapolis was gone. Chicago, too. Most major population centers east of the Rockies. The western states had been hit, but less comprehensively. Something about missile defense systems performing better than expected over the Pacific approach vectors. While monitoring the broadcasts, I also kept an eye on the dam systems. The structure had held, but there were concerning pressure readings in the eastern spillway, exactly where I'd been inspecting that stress fracture before everything happened. The nuclear strikes had evidently exacerbated existing weaknesses. Not an immediate failure risk, but something that would need attention eventually. If there was an eventually. The second day brought a change in Carlos. He'd been checking radiation levels near the tunnel entrance every few hours, and the readings troubled him. "They're going down faster than expected," he told me, showing me the detector. "Theory says levels should still be much higher." "Maybe we got lucky with wind patterns," I suggested. "Or maybe the strikes were more targeted than we thought. Clean bombs." He shook his head. "Or maybe the readings are wrong. This equipment isn't perfect." What he didn't say, but what I could see in his eyes, was hope. Hope that he could leave sooner than planned. hope that he could reach his family in Lakeville. Tom was still mostly non-responsive, staring at his phone even though it hadn't worked since the first strikes. I worried about him, but there wasn't much I could do except make sure he ate and drank. The emergency broadcasts continued through the second day, but with subtle changes in tone. Military channels began reporting atmospheric anomalies over several regions. Unusual electromagnetic interference. Unidentified aircraft not matching known military profiles. Probably just equipment malfunctioning, Carlos suggested when I mentioned it. EMP effects can linger. Maybe, I said, but something didn't feel right. The broadcasts were too consistent, coming from too many different sources. By the afternoon of that second day, Carlos had made his decision. He was leaving. "Readings are down to 8 rems per hour," he said, showing me the detector. "That's survivable for short exposure. I can make it to the maintenance shed where the utility vehicles are parked. If one of them starts, I can be in Lakeville in an hour." I tried to talk him out of it. Even if the vehicles work, the roads will be impassable. Debris, abandoned cars, structural collapses. And what if Lakeville got hit too? "It's a small town," he said, gathering supplies into a backpack. "Low priority target." "The fallout doesn't care about priority targets," I countered. "It goes where the wind takes it." But his mind was made up. I gave him extra rations, the spare radiation detector, and my multi-tool. He thanked me, shook my hand, and headed up the tunnel toward the entrance. I never saw him again. That night, the broadcasts became even stranger. Between tactical updates and emergency instructions, there were coded messages we couldn't understand and references to phenomena that didn't make sense in the context of nuclear war. Contact established in Sector 7. Visual confirmation of anomalous craft over remaining Atlantic fleet. All units maintain Protocol 16 when encountering non-standard aircraft. Tom finally seemed to emerge from his shock enough to notice. "What are they talking about?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but something's happening beyond the nuclear exchange." We were both exhausted, running on minimal sleep and maximum stress. When Tom suggested we try to rest for a few hours, I agreed. We took turns. 3 hours sleep, 3 hours watch. The emergency lights dimmed automatically to conserve power. During my watch, around what my watch said was 3 in the morning, I heard it for the first time. Not through the broadcasts, but through the structure itself. A humming vibration coming through the concrete, different from anything I'd felt during the nuclear strikes. It modulated in strange patterns, rising and falling in a way that seemed deliberate. I woke Tom. "Do you hear that?" He listened, then nodded slowly. "What is it? Some kind of equipment failure?" "Nothing in the dam makes that sound," I said, checking the monitoring systems. All readings were normal, no pressure anomalies, no structural stresses beyond what we'd already documented. The vibration continued for about 20 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. We sat in silence, waiting for it to return, but it didn't. By morning, day 3 in the tunnels, the emergency broadcasts were becoming sporadic. Longer periods of static or silence between transmissions. Those that came through clearly were increasingly coded or guarded in their language. All regional commands implement OPAL protocols immediately. Confirm non-human origin of craft in Sectors 2, 5, and 9. Civilian broadcasts suspended until further notice by order of Stratcom. Non-human origin. The words hung in the air between us. "They can't mean what it sounds like," Tom said. "I don't know what else they could mean," I replied. The monitoring terminal showed our generator fuel was running low. We had maybe 12 hours of power left. After that, we'd lose the monitoring systems and climate control. The emergency lighting would switch to battery backup, but that would only last another day. We needed to make decisions. The radiation levels near the entrance had decreased to about 5 rems per hour, dangerous for extended exposure, but survivable for short periods. Our food would run out tomorrow. The water filtration would stop working when we lost power. We should scout the immediate area, I suggested. Quick in and out, just to see what we're dealing with. Then we can make a plan. Tom agreed, though reluctantly. We gathered essential gear, radiation detectors, flashlights, whatever food we could carry, first aid kits, the emergency radio. I found protective coveralls in a maintenance locker. Not proper radiation suits, but better than nothing. We approached the tunnel entrance cautiously. The heavy metal door had sealed automatically when the emergency systems activated. I checked the radiation detector one last time, still showing 5 rems per hour. Survivable for maybe an hour of exposure before we'd need to seek shelter again. "Ready?" I asked. Tom nodded, though his face said otherwise. I turned the release wheel and pushed the door open just enough to look outside. What I saw made no sense. The sky wasn't blue. It wasn't the ash gray I'd expected either. It had a greenish tinge, like light filtering through dirty stained glass. The air seemed hazy, but not with dust or smoke. Something else, something that moved differently. I closed the door quickly. "What is it?" Tom asked. "I don't know," I said truthfully. "But we need more information before we go out there." We returned to the pump room and tried to boost the signal on the emergency radio. Most frequencies were static, but we caught fragments of military communications. Confirmed landing in Sector 4, ground forces deployed. All units withdraw from contact zones. Repeat, do not engage. Unknown technology neutralizing defensive capabilities. That night, our third in the tunnels, the humming returned, louder and lasting longer. The concrete vibrated around us for nearly an hour. The emergency lights flickered, and for a moment I was afraid we'd lose power completely. "It's searching," Tom said suddenly. "What do you mean?" "It's like sonar," he said. "It's mapping what's down here, looking for survivors." I didn't want to believe it, but it made a terrible kind of sense. If something was out there using technology we didn't understand, it might be scanning for signs of life. "We need to get deeper," I said, grabbing essential supplies. "Further into the tunnels, away from the entrance." We moved to the lowest level of the maintenance tunnels, a storage area for heavy equipment rarely used, except during major repairs. It was cold and damp, but the concrete was thickest here. The humming eventually stopped. We waited in darkness, preserving our flashlight batteries, listening for any sign that we'd been detected. There was nothing but silence. Morning came, according to our watches. The generator finally ran out of fuel during the night, and the climate control system shut down. The emergency lighting switched to battery backup, casting everything in a dimmer blue glow. We had maybe one more day of food. The water filtration had stopped working. Our situation was becoming critical. "We have to leave today," I told Tom. "No choice now." He nodded, resigned. "Where do we go?" "Away from population centers," I said. "Away from whatever's happening in Minneapolis. Small towns might be intact, might have supplies. We head west, into rural areas." We packed everything useful we could carry: the radiation detectors, water purification tablets, first aid kits, tools, emergency radio, remaining food. We put on the protective coveralls and made our way back to the tunnel entrance. At the door, I checked the radiation detector again. The levels had dropped further, about 3 rems per hour. Still dangerous for long exposure, but we could manage a few hours if necessary. I put my hand on the release lever and looked at Tom. "Whatever's out there, we face it together," I said. "Stay close, move fast, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" He nodded grimly. I turned the lever and pushed the door open fully. The strange greenish light flooded in, momentarily blinding after days in the dim emergency lighting. As my eyes adjusted, I stepped outside into a world transformed. The concrete apron in front of the maintenance tunnel was intact, but covered with a fine gray ash. Beyond that, trees that should have been summer green were blackened and bare. The reservoir's water level had dropped dramatically, exposing mudflats along the shoreline. And there, on the horizon where Minneapolis should have been, was something impossible. A massive structure hanging in the sky, not an aircraft or a cloud or anything I recognized. It was geometric, symmetrical, and utterly alien. Smaller objects moved around it like insects circling a hive. Tom stepped out beside me, his breath catching as he saw what I was seeing. "Dear God," he whispered, "what is that?" Before I could answer, we heard it. A high-pitched whine different from the humming we'd experienced in the tunnels. It was coming from above and behind us. We turned slowly and looked up. A craft of some kind was descending toward the dam, sleek, metallic, with no visible propulsion system. It wasn't like any aircraft I'd ever seen. It moved with deliberate precision, scanning the structure below. "Back inside," I whispered. "Now." We retreated into the tunnel, pulling the door closed as quietly as possible. Through the small reinforced window, we watched as the craft hovered over the main dam structure, emitting pulses of light that swept across the concrete. "It's scanning," Tom said. "Like I told you." "Looking for structural weaknesses," I added, drawing on my expertise, "or survivors." The craft continued its methodical examination of the dam for several minutes. Then, without warning, it fired something at the eastern spillway, exactly where I'd been inspecting that stress fracture before everything happened. The impact wasn't explosive. Instead, a bright blue light enveloped the area, then faded. When it cleared, the concrete looked different, degraded somehow, as if decades of erosion had happened in seconds. I understood immediately what they were doing. They were accelerating structural failures, creating strategic collapses, not destroying infrastructure outright, but ensuring it would fail when used. "They're engineers," I whispered, "like me, but they're doing the opposite of my job." The craft moved to another section of the dam, repeating the process. Each time, the targeted area seemed to age and degrade visibly. "Why?" Tom asked. "Why not just destroy it completely?" "Controlled failure," I explained, professional assessment overriding my fear. "If the dam collapses suddenly, the flood would wipe out everything downstream. But if it fails gradually, over days or weeks, people would move into the area thinking it's safe," Tom finished. "They'd start rebuilding, and then—" "Exactly. Secondary casualties, more efficient." I didn't want to admire the strategy, but professionally, I had to acknowledge its effectiveness. It was exactly how I would approach demolishing a structure if I wanted to maximize impact with minimal energy expenditure. We watched as the craft completed its work, then rose rapidly into the sky, rejoining others circling near the massive structure over Minneapolis. "We can't go west," I said, revising our plan. "The reservoir will flood that entire valley when the dam fails." "East?" Tom suggested. "Toward Minneapolis? Toward that?" I gestured at the alien construct hovering in the distance. "South, then?" I nodded. "South. Away from the dam, away from the city. Cross-country, avoiding roads and open areas." We gathered our gear again, added more water from the dam's emergency supply, and prepared to leave. But first, I needed to check something. I led Tom back to the terminal in the pump room. The backup battery was still providing enough power for basic functions. I pulled up the structural integrity monitoring system and confirmed what I suspected. The alien craft had accelerated the failure points I'd been inspecting days ago. The dam was now in critical condition. It would fail within days, maybe sooner. "We need to warn people," Tom said. "How? Communications are down. And even if we could, where would they go? What's waiting out there might be worse than flooding." I made a quick decision. I found a maintenance clipboard and wrote out what I knew: the dam's condition, expected failure timeline, flood projection map. I left it by the tunnel entrance where any human survivors checking the facility would find it. Then we left, stepping out into the green-tinged daylight, into a world where nuclear war had become the lesser of two catastrophes. The world outside the dam was a study in calculated destruction. That's what struck me immediately. Not the chaos I expected from nuclear war, but the methodical precision of what had happened, like looking at demolition work done by professionals. The forest surrounding the dam had been partially flattened, trees knocked down in concentric circles radiating from impact points. But some trees still stood, blackened and bare, but structurally intact. The access road was buckled and cracked, but not completely destroyed. The administrative buildings were damaged, but not obliterated. It was as if someone had calibrated the destruction precisely, enough to render everything unusable, but not enough to completely erase it. Efficient, calculated. Tom and I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The radiation detector showed elevated levels, around 3 rems per hour. Dangerous for prolonged exposure, but survivable for the few hours we needed to find better shelter. "Which way?" Tom asked, his voice barely audible. I pointed south, away from the dam and away from Minneapolis. "That valley leads to farmland, small towns. Might find supplies, maybe other survivors." We moved cautiously, staying under tree cover when possible. The strange greenish tinge to the daylight made everything look sickly and alien. It wasn't just atmospheric effects from the nuclear strikes. This was something else entirely. The air had a metallic taste that caught in the back of my throat. Every few minutes I checked the sky, watching for signs of the craft we'd seen scanning the dam. Nothing visible for now, but that didn't mean we weren't being watched. After about an hour of hiking, we reached a ridge that gave us a better view of the surrounding landscape. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. The alien craft were systematic in their approach. From our elevated position, I could see patterns of destruction radiating outward from Minneapolis. Main roads damaged but not destroyed. Power lines cut at strategic intervals. Water treatment facilities compromised. "They're engineers," I said again, almost to myself. "They're assessing infrastructure and causing controlled failures. Maximum disruption with minimal energy expenditure." Tom looked at me. "Why? Why not just wipe us out completely if that's what they want?" "Maybe they don't want the planet destroyed. Maybe they want it intact, but with us gone." I considered the strategy. Or maybe they're hurting us. Hurting? Control the movement of survivors by making certain areas uninhabitable while leaving escape routes open. Guide people where you want them to go. I pointed toward the patterns I was seeing. Major highways were blocked at strategic points. Overpasses collapsed, tunnels sealed, but secondary roads remained partially navigable. It created clear channels where survivors would naturally flow. "We need to avoid those obvious routes," I said. "Cross-country, staying away from anything that looks like an intended evacuation path." We continued south, moving through increasingly rural areas. The devastation was less severe here, further from nuclear targets and apparently lower priority for the alien engineers. After several hours of walking, we came upon a small farmhouse set back from a county road. No signs of life, but the structure appeared largely intact. We approached cautiously, watching for any movement. The radiation detector showed lower levels here, about 1 rem per hour. Still elevated, but much safer than near the dam. The farmhouse door was unlocked. Inside, everything was undisturbed, as if the occupants had simply stepped out momentarily. Family photos on the walls, dishes in the sink, a calendar on the refrigerator marked with a child's soccer schedule. "Hello," Tom called out. No response. We searched the house methodically. No people, but we found supplies: canned food, bottled water, first aid kit, flashlights, batteries. In the basement, there was a gun cabinet with a hunting rifle and ammunition. Tom, who had military experience, checked the weapon while I continued searching. In the kitchen, I found a battery-powered radio. I turned it on, scanning frequencies. Mostly static, but occasionally fragments of broadcasts broke through. "All survivors proceed to designated collection points for evacuation. Do not attempt to engage or communicate with non-human entities. Military forces establishing secure zone in Region 4. The broadcasts were too fragmented to determine locations or timelines, but they confirmed what we already knew. Organized human resistance was attempting to establish safe zones somewhere. In the living room, I found something unexpected: a hand-drawn map on the dining table, showing what appeared to be evacuation routes. Routes that matched exactly the patterns of controlled destruction I'd observed. Someone had been here before us, had seen the same patterns, and had mapped them out. At the bottom of the map was a handwritten note: "They're guiding us somewhere. Don't follow the easy paths." I showed Tom the map. Someone else figured it out. He nodded grimly. "So, where did they go?" A noise outside interrupted our conversation, the same high-pitched whine we'd heard at the dam. We quickly extinguished all lights and moved to windows to observe. One of the alien craft was moving slowly down the county road, scanning methodically. It wasn't as large as the one we'd seen at the dam, perhaps the size of a small car, but it moved with the same deliberate precision. The craft paused at each structure along the road, emitting pulses of light that swept across buildings. At a farmhouse about half a mile away, the craft detected something. It hovered lower, intensifying its scan. Then, without warning, it fired a brilliant blue beam. I couldn't see what happened next, but I heard screams, human screams. "They're hunting survivors," Tom whispered. The craft continued down the road, approaching our position. We retreated to the basement, hoping the additional structure would mask our presence from whatever detection technology they were using. The basement was partially finished, with concrete walls and a small window well at ground level. I could see the alien craft's lights sweeping across the property as it approached. The basement grew eerily quiet as we held our breath. The light swept across the window well, casting strange shadows on the concrete wall. The craft hovered above the farmhouse for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. Then, apparently detecting nothing of interest, it moved on. We waited another 30 minutes before venturing upstairs again. By then, darkness was falling. A darkness tinged with that same unnatural green glow that had pervaded the daylight. "We can't stay here," I said. "They're clearly hunting house to house." Tom agreed. "Where then?" I considered our options. Underground, sewers, maintenance tunnels, old mine shafts, anything that might shield us from their detection technology. "You know about those things?" "Part of my job," I explained. "Structural assessment includes underground infrastructure. I've mapped drainage systems, utility tunnels, abandoned mines, anything that might affect surface stability." This was our advantage. My specialized knowledge, normally used to prevent structural failures, could now help us exploit the weaknesses in the systems around us. I spread out the map we'd found and studied it. If the patterns held, there would be a systematic sweep moving outward from major population centers. The farmlands would be lower priority, but they would get to them eventually. "There's an old limestone mining operation about 5 miles south of here," I said. recalling the geological surveys I'd studied for dam projects in the region. The tunnels extend for miles underground. Some were converted to mushroom farms, some are just abandoned. Will they be safe from radiation? Underground is always safer, and this far from major targets, the levels are already dropping. We gathered all the supplies we could carry: food, water, medical items, the radio, flashlights, batteries. Tom took the hunting rifle and ammunition. I found work gloves, dust masks, and tools that might be useful underground. We left the farmhouse and headed south, traveling cross-country to avoid roads. The strange green luminescence in the sky provided just enough light to navigate by. Occasionally, we could see the lights of alien craft in the distance, moving in their methodical search patterns. After several hours of careful progress, we reached the old mining operation. The main entrance was partially collapsed, but I located a secondary access shaft that was still open. It looked like it had been used recently, fresh footprints in the dust. Someone else had the same idea, Tom noted. We entered cautiously, flashlights illuminating a tunnel that extended into darkness. The temperature dropped immediately, a constant 55 degrees year-round in these deep limestone formations. Our footsteps echoed slightly, but the sound was absorbed by the porous stone. The tunnel opened into larger chambers where limestone had been extracted decades ago. Support pillars of natural stone remained, creating a cathedral-like space underground. Some areas showed signs of the mushroom farming operations that had once occupied the space: abandoned growing beds, irrigation systems, work tables. And then we saw them, other survivors. A small group, perhaps 15 people, had established a camp in one of the larger chambers. They had electric lanterns, supplies arranged neatly, even a small generator running on minimal power. They spotted us immediately, and several men with weapons moved forward defensively. I raised my hands to show we weren't a threat. "We're just looking for shelter," I called out. "We saw the alien craft scanning for survivors." A woman stepped forward, mid-50s with the weathered look of a farmer. "Check them," she ordered, and 2 men approached with what I recognized as a Geiger counter. They scanned us for radiation and checked our supplies before allowing us to approach the main group. Once cleared, the woman introduced herself as Margaret. She'd been the county emergency management coordinator before everything happened. "We've been gathering survivors for 3 days," she explained. "Anyone who can make it here. We have about 30 people now, scattered through different chambers for safety." "You knew to come underground," I observed. She nodded. "The alien search technology seems to have limitations. They detect heat signatures, movement, electrical emissions, but the limestone insulates against their scans. At least so far." I introduced myself and explained my background in structural engineering and demolitions. Margaret's eyes lit up. "We could use someone with your expertise. We're trying to map safe routes, establish supply caches. Understanding structural weaknesses is valuable." Tom introduced himself as well, mentioning his military experience. Margaret immediately connected him with a former National Guard officer who was coordinating their defense plans. As we settled in, I studied the maps they'd created. They'd been observing the alien activity for days, noting patterns and behaviors. Their observations matched mine. The aliens were systematically disabling infrastructure in ways that created controlled failures rather than outright destruction. "They're terraforming," said a man introduced as Dr. Chen, a geology professor from a nearby college. "But not the entire planet. Specific regions." "For what purpose?" I asked. "We don't know yet. But they're particularly interested in water resources and certain mineral deposits. They've been extensively scanning and sampling both." That's when I remembered the dam. They were degrading the concrete structure at Westbrook Dam, creating weaknesses that would cause failure within days. Dr. Chen nodded. They've done the same at other water control structures, not destroying them outright, but ensuring they'll fail when used. Flood control, I muttered, pieces falling into place. They're disabling flood control systems right before they do something that will cause massive flooding. Margaret looked alarmed. What are you suggesting? I think they're going to change the hydrology of entire regions, create new watersheds, flood certain areas while draining others. It made terrible sense. As a structural engineer, I understood the relationship between water systems and land use. If you wanted to render large areas uninhabitable quickly, controlling water was the most efficient approach. But why? Someone asked. Why not just kill us all directly? Resources, Dr. Chen suggested. They want the planet's resources intact. Massive bombing or other direct attacks would damage what they're here to collect. Tom rejoined us after speaking with the National Guard officer. They're organizing resistance cells, he reported, using underground facilities where possible. Military remnants are establishing communication networks and gathering intelligence. Margaret unfolded a larger map showing the entire region. We've been tracking alien activity patterns. They established their primary base over Minneapolis first, then secondary bases over these smaller cities. Their ground operations expand outward from these bases in predictable patterns. I studied the map, seeing not random destruction but a carefully orchestrated engineering project. As a demolition expert, I could appreciate the efficiency of their approach. Target key structural elements, create cascading failures, achieve maximum effect with minimal input. They think like engineers, I said, like demolition experts. They understand how systems fail. So you can predict what they'll do next, Margaret suggested. I nodded slowly. Maybe, if I can understand their overall objective. That night, we established our place in the underground community. I was assigned to a technical team focused on infrastructure assessment. Tom joined a security group patrolling the perimeter of the mine complex. As I lay on an improvised bed, staring at the limestone ceiling, I realized something that both terrified and empowered me. The aliens thought like I did. They approached problems the way I would, analyzing structural weaknesses, calculating cascade effects, maximizing efficiency, which meant I could potentially predict their actions. And if I could predict them, maybe we could find ways to counter them. I closed my eyes, mind racing with possibilities. For the first time since the nuclear strikes, I felt something other than fear. I felt purpose. Our first day in the limestone tunnels was spent gathering intelligence. Margaret had organized the survivors with military efficiency, teams assigned to security, food, medical needs, and reconnaissance. I was immediately put to work with the technical assessment group, using my structural engineering background to evaluate their underground shelter. The mine complex was ideal for our purposes. The limestone formation provided natural insulation against radiation and apparently against alien detection technology as well. The tunnels extended for miles in a complex network, with multiple access points and natural ventilation shafts. Some areas had been modernized for the mushroom farming operations, with electrical conduits, water systems, and reinforced supports. I walked the main tunnels with Dr. Chen, the geology professor, evaluating structural integrity and identifying potential weaknesses. Most of the complex was remarkably stable. The mining operation had been professional, leaving appropriate support pillars and reinforcing critical junctions. The original mining ended in the 60s, Dr. Chen explained, but the mushroom farming continued until just a few years ago. They maintained the structural elements well. I tested support beams, examined ceiling fractures, and mapped potential failure points. Overall, it's sound, I concluded. The northern section has some concerning ceiling stress, but nothing immediate. We should restrict heavy activity there and monitor those stress fractures. Dr. Chen nodded. What about defense? If they find us, could we collapse strategic tunnels to protect the main chambers? The question took me back to my demolition days. Yes, but carefully. Uncontrolled collapse could compromise the entire system. I'd need to calculate precise failure points. While I worked, Margaret's reconnaissance teams returned with new information about alien activities on the surface. They'd observed the systematic scanning operations expanding outward from Minneapolis, moving in a grid pattern that suggested they were searching for something specific. They're particularly interested in water sources, reported Lisa, a former environmental engineer who led one of the recon teams. They've placed devices in streams, lakes, even farm irrigation systems. Sampling? Asked Dr. Chen. More than that, the devices appear to be modifying the water somehow, changing color, consistency. That evening, Margaret called a meeting of all survivors in the main chamber. About 30 people gathered, a mix of local farmers, a few professionals like Dr. Chen, some passing travelers who had been caught in the area when everything happened, and even a family with 2 children who had hidden in their basement during the initial attacks. We've been monitoring alien activities for 4 days now, Margaret began. They established their primary base over Minneapolis immediately after the nuclear exchange. They're clearly coordinating their activities, working in a systematic pattern that expands outward from their base. She unfolded a map showing their observations. Red marks indicated confirmed alien craft sightings, blue showed infrastructure targets they'd attacked, and green showed areas where they'd placed unknown devices. They're terraforming, Dr. Chen reiterated his theory, modifying our environment for their purposes. But why wait until after nuclear strikes? Someone asked. Why not just invade directly? I'd been considering this question since we first spotted the alien craft. The nuclear exchange weakened us, I suggested, destroyed our military capacity, disrupted communications, created chaos, perfect conditions for an invasion. Or they caused it, said an older man at the back of the group. Everyone turned to look at him. He introduced himself as Robert, a retired Air Force officer. What if they manipulated us into the nuclear exchange, created the conditions for conflict, pushed us over the edge? The idea sent a chill through the room. It made a terrible kind of sense. The sudden escalation of international tensions, the communications failures that prevented diplomatic solutions, the seemingly coordinated launches from multiple nations simultaneously. If that's true, Margaret said slowly, then this was planned. They've been watching us, studying us, waiting for the right moment. And now they're implementing Phase 2, I added, systematic modification of our infrastructure and environment. The discussion continued late into the night, with people sharing observations and theories. Tom joined me afterward as we prepared our sleeping area in one of the smaller chambers. What do you think? He asked. Did they cause the nuclear war? I considered the question carefully. It makes strategic sense. If you wanted to invade a technologically capable planet with minimal losses, you'd want them to weaken themselves first. So, what's the next phase? Tom looked grim. What happens after they finish their scanning and modifications? I don't know, I admitted, but I think we'll find out soon. The next morning, Margaret assigned me to a reconnaissance team. My structural expertise would be valuable in assessing what the aliens were targeting. Tom joined us, providing security with his military experience. We moved through the mine tunnels to an exit point about 2 miles from our main chamber. This exit emerged in a wooded ravine, well hidden from aerial observation. The radiation detector showed lower levels now, less than 1 rem per hour in this area. Still elevated, but not immediately dangerous. Our team consisted of 5 people: myself, Tom, Lisa, the environmental engineer, a local farmer named Jackson who knew the area intimately, and a young woman named May, who had been a drone hobbyist and had excellent observational skills. We moved carefully through the woods, staying under cover as much as possible. Jackson led us to an elevated ridge that provided a view of the surrounding farmland without exposing us. From our vantage point, we could see alien activity clearly. 3 smaller craft were systematically moving across the landscape, placing devices at regular intervals in fields, streams, and at key infrastructure points like power line junctions and water pumping stations. The devices were unlike anything I'd seen before. Cylindrical objects about the size of a fire extinguisher, with extending components that burrowed into the ground or attached to structures. They emitted a pulsing blue light that seemed to intensify on a regular cycle. "What are they?" Tom whispered. Lisa had brought binoculars and was studying the devices intently. "Some kind of environmental modification technology. Look at the soil around the ones they placed yesterday." I took the binoculars and observed where she pointed. The vegetation around the devices had changed color, taking on a purplish tinge. The soil itself appeared different, darker, with an almost crystalline quality catching the strange green-tinged light. "They're changing the fundamental chemistry," Lisa said. "Soil composition, water properties, maybe even atmospheric conditions locally." "For what purpose?" I asked. "Terraforming," Lisa repeated Dr. Chen's theory. "Making our environment more like theirs, whatever that is." We continued observing for several hours, documenting each device placement and noting patterns. The alien craft worked with mechanical precision, never deviating from their grid pattern, never demonstrating anything that looked like individual decision-making. "They're automated," May suggested, "or remotely controlled. They're following a program." I considered this. If they're automated, they might have predictable limitations, standard response patterns. As we watched, something unexpected happened. A deer emerged from the woods, moving into the open field where one of the devices had been placed. The animal approached cautiously, curious about the strange object. The nearest alien craft immediately changed its behavior, breaking from its grid pattern to move toward the deer. It emitted a scanning beam that swept over the animal. The deer froze, then convulsed violently before collapsing. The craft hovered over the fallen deer for several minutes, continuing to scan. Then, to our horror, it extended a mechanical appendage and extracted what appeared to be tissue samples from the animal. After completing its sampling, the craft returned to its programmed grid pattern, continuing device placement as if nothing had interrupted it. "They're collecting biological samples," Lisa whispered, "studying Earth life." "They reacted to movement," I noted. "The deer triggered some kind of detection protocol." "So they can be distracted," Tom said thoughtfully, "pulled off their programmed patterns." We continued our observations until mid-afternoon, when Jackson signaled that we should retreat. The alien craft were moving in our direction, continuing their systematic grid pattern. We returned to the mine complex and reported our findings to Margaret and the other team leaders. The information about the devices and the craft's reaction to the deer sparked immediate discussion. If they're changing soil and water chemistry, they're making the environment hostile to Earth life, Dr. Chen concluded, perhaps preparing it for their own forms of life. "But they're still studying our biology," Lisa added. "The way they sampled the deer suggests they're collecting data on how Earth organisms respond to their modifications." I thought about the devices, about their placement pattern, about the infrastructure targets they had selected. A pattern was emerging, but I couldn't quite see it clearly yet. "They're engineers," I repeated my earlier observation. "They're approaching this like a construction project. Site preparation, environmental modification, Infrastructure adjustment? Margaret looked at me. Can you predict what they'll target next? I spread out our map, studying the pattern of device placements and infrastructure attacks. They're focusing on water systems and energy distribution nodes. If the pattern holds, they'll move into this area next. I circled a region about 10 miles from our position. There's a regional electrical substation here and a water treatment facility here. So, we avoid that area, Margaret concluded. Or we observe it, Tom suggested. Gather more intelligence about their methods and capabilities. A debate ensued about our next steps. Some advocated remaining hidden, focusing on survival. Others, including Tom, argued for more active intelligence gathering to understand what we were facing. I found myself siding with Tom. Knowledge is our only advantage, I said. We need to understand their patterns if we want any chance of survival. Margaret considered both perspectives, then made her decision. We'll continue reconnaissance, but cautiously. No unnecessary risks. Our primary goal remains survival and protection of our group. That night, as most of the others slept, I worked with Dr. Chen and Lisa to analyze the data we'd gathered. We spread maps across a makeshift table, marking alien activity patterns, device placements, and infrastructure targets. There's a geometric precision to it, I noted, tracing lines between device placements. They're creating a grid with regular intervals between devices. Like a lattice structure, Dr. Chen suggested, or a mesh network. I thought about mesh networks, about structural support systems, about how you'd reinforce a failing building. They're creating a support framework, I said suddenly, for whatever comes next. Lisa looked up sharply. What do you mean? In structural engineering, when you're reinforcing a failing system, you first establish a secondary support framework. You distribute the load across multiple points, create a new underlying structure before you remove the old one. Dr. Chen caught on immediately. They're building a new environmental support system before they fully dismantle our existing one. The implications were staggering. They weren't just modifying our environment, they were systematically replacing it with something else entirely. Something that would support their life forms, but not ours. As this realization settled over us, a low, rumbling vibration passed through the limestone tunnels. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. The vibration increased in intensity and small rocks began to fall. Earthquake, Lisa suggested, looking alarmed. No, I said, immediately recognizing the pattern. This is controlled, deliberate. The vibration continued for nearly a minute, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. In the silence that followed, we could hear shouts from other chambers as people were awakened by the disturbance. Margaret appeared at the entrance to our chamber. What was that? I shook my head. Not natural. They're doing something on the surface that's affecting subterranean structures. Could they have found us? Her voice was tense. I don't think so, I replied. This felt systematic, like the other patterns we've observed. They're affecting all underground structures, not targeting us specifically. But even as I said it, I wasn't entirely convinced. The precision of the vibration, the way it passed through the limestone in waves, suggested a sophisticated understanding of geological structures. If they were mapping underground features, they might eventually locate our hiding place. Margaret organized teams to check the tunnels for damage. I joined the structural assessment group, examining support pillars and ceiling integrity throughout the complex. Most areas showed only minor effects. Some increased dust, a few small rockfalls, but the northern section I'd already identified as weak had developed new stress fractures. We need to reinforce this immediately, I told the team, or abandon this section entirely. As we worked to shore up the weakened supports with timber bracing, I considered our situation. The aliens were systematically transforming the surface world while simultaneously affecting underground structures. They were closing off our options methodically, like a demolition expert planning a controlled implosion. I thought again about their approach, the precision, the efficiency, the systematic nature of their actions. They thought like engineers, which meant they had an engineer's weaknesses as well. Engineers rely on data, on patterns, on predictable outcomes. Unexpected variables can disrupt even the most carefully calculated plans. If we wanted to survive, we needed to become the unexpected variable in their equations. When we finished reinforcing the damaged section, I sought out Tom. He was helping organize the security teams, establishing patrol routes and observation posts near each tunnel entrance. "We need to disrupt their patterns," I told him, explaining my realization about their methodical approach. He nodded slowly. "Create chaos in their system. Force them to adapt rather than follow their program." Exactly. If they're automated or following strict protocols, unpredictable actions might cause them to reveal weaknesses or limitations. Tom looked thoughtful. "It's risky. Drawing their attention could lead them right to us." "We're running out of time," I countered. "Whatever they're preparing for, it's happening soon. Those devices, the systematic infrastructure modifications, the vibrations affecting underground structures, it's all building toward something." He considered this, then nodded. "I'll talk to Margaret, but we'll need a plan that minimizes our exposure while maximizing disruption to their operations." As Tom went to find Margaret, I returned to our improvised mapping table. If I could understand the pattern of device placements clearly enough, perhaps I could identify critical nodes in their system, points where disruption would have the greatest impact. I was studying the map when May approached. "I might have something useful," she said quietly. She placed a small object on the table, a partially disassembled drone controller. "I had this in my backpack when everything happened. It's not much, but if we could find a power source and something to control—" I stared at the controller, an idea forming. "We don't need to control our own drone," I said slowly. "What if we could interfere with theirs?" May's drone controller sparked something in my mind, a possibility I hadn't considered before. If the alien craft operated on automated protocols, they might have communication vulnerabilities we could exploit. Wireless signals, electromagnetic pulses, interference patterns, anything that disrupted their command and control systems could give us an advantage. "Their craft respond to environmental stimuli," I explained to May. "We saw how that one broke pattern to investigate the deer. If we could trigger multiple false readings simultaneously, we might be able to create confusion in their system." Her eyes lit up with understanding. "Electronic countermeasures, like military jamming technology but improvised." "Exactly. Can you modify that controller to broadcast interference signals?" She examined the device thoughtfully. "Maybe. I'd need components, signal amplifiers, power sources, antennas, and I'd need to know what frequencies they're using." That was the challenge. We needed more information about their technology before we could attempt to disrupt it. I sought out Margaret to discuss our reconnaissance plans. I found her with Tom and Robert, the retired Air Force officer, reviewing security protocols. They were discussing the vibrations we'd felt earlier. "It happened again while you were reinforcing the northern tunnels," Margaret informed me. "Same pattern, same duration. Every 3 hours, almost exactly." "They're mapping," Robert suggested, "sending out some kind of scanning pulse that penetrates underground structures. Standard military procedure, map the battlefield before engaging." I considered the implications. If they're scanning on a regular schedule, we can use that. Time our movements between pulses. Margaret nodded. "That's what we've started doing. No movement or activity during pulse periods, minimal electronic equipment powered up. We need more information about their technology, I explained. May thinks we might be able to disrupt their communications or control systems, but we need to understand how they operate first. Tom looked interested. Electronic warfare. Good thinking. Margaret considered it. We're planning another reconnaissance mission tomorrow. The substation you identified as their likely next target. If you're right about their patterns, we might be able to observe them up close. The next morning, our team prepared for the mission. This time, we included May for her technical expertise and Robert for his military knowledge. The same 5 from the previous day, myself, Tom, Lisa, Jackson, and May, plus Robert made 6. A larger group than was strictly safe, but we needed the combined knowledge. We moved through the tunnels to an exit point about 8 miles from our target, the regional electrical substation. The exit emerged in a drainage culvert beneath a rural county road, providing good cover for our emergence. The radiation readings were lower still, less than 0.5 rems per hour in this area. The immediate dangers from fallout were diminishing, replaced by the more insidious threat of alien terraforming. We traveled cross-country, avoiding roads and open areas. Jackson led us through woodlots, stream beds, and overgrown fence lines, natural features that provided cover from aerial observation. The journey took nearly 4 hours, with frequent stops to scan the sky for alien craft. The strange green tinge to the daylight had intensified since I first emerged from the dam tunnels. The air had a metallic taste that seemed stronger near areas where the aliens had placed their devices. Plant life was showing unusual effects, leaves curling in unnatural patterns, colors shifting toward purple and blue spectrums. The biological changes are accelerating, Lisa observed as we passed a stand of corn with strangely twisted stalks. Whatever they're doing, it's happening faster than I expected. We reached a position overlooking the electrical substation shortly before noon. The facility appeared undamaged, evidently not yet targeted by the aliens. It was still functioning, judging by the humming transformers and active indicator lights. We established an observation post in a small copse of trees about 400 yards from the perimeter fence. Robert unpacked a military-grade spotting scope he'd brought from the mine complex. "Now we wait," he said, setting up the scope on a small tripod. "If your pattern analysis is correct, they should arrive within the next 2 hours." While we waited, May examined the area with different eyes than the rest of us. Where I saw structural elements and stress points, she was looking for electronic and communication systems. "The substation has its own communications array," she noted, pointing to a small antenna cluster on one of the buildings, "probably for remote monitoring and control. If we could access that, we might be able to study the electromagnetic environment." "Too risky," Tom replied. "We're here to observe, not engage." I understood both perspectives. We needed information, but exposure meant danger. For now, observation was our safest approach. After about 90 minutes, Jackson spotted the first alien craft approaching from the northeast, the direction of Minneapolis. It was larger than the ones we'd seen placing devices in the fields, about the size of a delivery van. It moved with that same mechanical precision we'd observed before, following a direct line toward the substation. Robert focused the spotting scope. 3 more approaching from different vectors, he reported. Coordinated operation. We watched as the craft converged on the substation. They positioned themselves at equidistant points around the perimeter, hovering about 30 feet above ground level. Then, simultaneously, they extended what appeared to be scanning arrays and began sweeping the facility with blue-tinged beams. "They're assessing the infrastructure before modifying it," I whispered. "Just like at the dam." The scanning operation continued for approximately 10 minutes. Then, the craft repositioned, moving to specific points within the facility. one at the main transformer bank, one at the control building, one at the switching yard, and one at the communications array. What happened next was both fascinating and terrifying from an engineering perspective. Rather than destroying the components, the craft began systematically modifying them. Mechanical appendages extended from each craft, making precise adjustments to the equipment. The main transformer began emitting a different pitch, and the indicator lights on the control building changed from green to an unusual purple hue. They're not disabling it, I realized. They're repurposing it. For what? Tom asked. I don't know, but they're converting our infrastructure to serve their purposes rather than simply destroying it. May was watching intently, her focus on the craft near the communications array. They're maintaining the basic functionality while changing the output parameters, like converting a gasoline engine to run on a different fuel. After about 20 minutes, the craft completed their modifications and withdrew to hovering positions around the perimeter. The substation was still operational, still humming with electricity, but fundamentally altered in ways we couldn't fully comprehend. Then, something new happened. A larger craft appeared, descending from the clouds directly above the facility. This one was different, more organic in design, with flowing contours rather than the geometric precision of the smaller craft. It positioned itself centrally above the substation and extended what appeared to be a collection apparatus. That's not automated, Robert said quietly. That's piloted. We're looking at one of them. The larger craft remained stationary as energy visibly flowed from the modified substation up into its collection system, purplish arcs of electricity that defied normal physics. After several minutes, the collection ceased, and the craft ascended back into the clouds. The smaller craft resumed their activities, placing devices around the perimeter of the facility at regular intervals, the same type of devices we'd observed in the fields. They're creating another node in their network, Lisa suggested, using our power infrastructure to fuel whatever they're building. We continued observing for another hour as the smaller craft completed their work and departed. The substation remained operational, but fundamentally changed, now emitting a purplish glow and making sounds no human electrical equipment should produce. We need to get back, Robert finally said. Report what we've seen. As we prepared to withdraw, May made a surprising request. I need to get closer, just for a few minutes. There's something I want to check. Tom immediately objected. Too dangerous. We've seen what we came for. Not everything, May insisted. The communications array, I need to see if they've maintained the same transmission protocols or completely replaced them. It could be crucial for developing countermeasures. I found myself supporting her. The craft have left. A quick examination might give us valuable information. Robert considered it. Quick in and out. 2 people only. The rest maintain observation positions. Tom still looked unhappy, but didn't object further. After a brief discussion, it was decided that May and I would approach the facility while the others maintained overwatch. My structural knowledge combined with her electronic expertise made us the logical choice. We moved carefully down the hillside, using drainage ditches and equipment sheds for cover. The perimeter fence showed signs of modification. The metal itself seemed altered, with a crystalline quality that caught the light strangely. Don't touch anything, I warned May. Observe only. We reached the communications array building at the south corner of the facility. The door was unlocked, or rather, the locking mechanism had been altered to a non-functional state. Inside, the equipment was still recognizable as human technology, but modified in ways that defied easy explanation. May examined the transmission equipment without touching it. They've maintained the basic radio frequency capabilities, she observed, but added something else. Some kind of quantum entanglement system, maybe? I don't even have words for what I'm seeing. I was examining the structural modifications. The support beams, once standard steel, now had the same crystalline quality we'd observed elsewhere. They caught the light differently, refracting it in ways that regular metal shouldn't. They're changing the fundamental molecular structure, I realized, not just repurposing equipment, but transforming the materials themselves. May nodded. Converting our technology into something compatible with theirs, but maintaining enough of the original functionality to utilize our power grid. She pulled out a small device, a modified smartphone with additional components attached. I'm going to take some readings. Passive only. No transmissions. She activated the device and began scanning the equipment. Numbers and waveforms appeared on the screen, meaningless to me, but evidently significant to her. They're broadcasting on our standard frequencies, but with a modulation pattern I've never seen before. And there's something else underneath. Quantum states changing in response to the broadcast. A noise from outside interrupted her investigation. Tom's warning whistle. 3 short bursts. Danger approaching. We moved quickly to the window. A small alien craft was returning, approaching from the east. We had perhaps 90 seconds before it would reach the facility. Out the back, I said, leading May toward a rear exit. Stay low, use the drainage ditch for cover. We slipped out and dropped into the concrete drainage channel that ran along the southern perimeter. The ditch was about 4 feet deep, providing concealment if we stayed low. We moved as quickly as we could while remaining silent, heading back toward our observation point. The alien craft passed overhead, its scanning beam sweeping the area. We froze, pressing ourselves against the concrete wall of the ditch. The beam passed just feet away, but didn't adjust to investigate the drainage channel. They have blind spots, May whispered when the craft moved on. Their scanning patterns are predictable. We continued our withdrawal, eventually rejoining the rest of the team at our observation point. Tom looked relieved but irritated. That was too close, he said. We need to move. Now. We began our journey back to the mine complex, taking a different route than our approach path. As we traveled, May shared what she had discovered about the alien technology. They're using our communication infrastructure as a foundation, but adding entirely new capabilities on top. The modifications allow transmission of information we can't even conceptualize. Can you develop countermeasures? Robert asked. Maybe. I recorded some of their transmission patterns. If we can analyze them, we might be able to create interference. About halfway back to our exit point, we felt it again, the rhythmic vibration passing through the ground. We immediately stopped moving and took cover, remembering Margaret's protocol about remaining still during the scanning pulses. The vibration continued for exactly 1 minute, then ceased. As we prepared to resume our journey, Jackson held up his hand for silence. He pointed toward a clearing about 200 yards ahead. A new type of alien device was descending from the sky, larger than the ones we'd observed being placed in fields, more complex in design. It landed in the center of the clearing and immediately began to unfold, extending components in multiple directions. Ground station, Robert whispered, similar to what we saw at the substation, but self-contained. We watched as the device established itself, burrowing components into the earth and extending antenna-like structures upward. Within minutes, it began emitting the same purplish glow we'd observed at the modified substation. Another node in their network, Lisa confirmed. They're establishing a grid. We carefully circumvented the clearing, adding significant time to our journey but avoiding detection. By the time we reached our exit point, the drainage culvert, darkness was falling. The strange green luminescence in the sky provided just enough light to navigate by. We entered the culvert and made our way back through the tunnels to the main chamber of the mine complex. Margaret and Dr. Chen were waiting for our report, along with several other survivors who had gathered to hear what we'd discovered. I described the substation modifications in detail, explaining how the aliens were repurposing our infrastructure rather than simply destroying it. May shared her observations about their communication systems, while Lisa described the accelerating environmental changes we'd witnessed. "They're creating a network," Margaret summarized, "using our existing infrastructure as a foundation for something else entirely." "Not just a network," I added, "a complete environmental conversion system. They're systematically transforming our world into something that supports their biology rather than ours." Dr. Chen looked grim. "How long do we have before the transformation becomes incompatible with human life?" Lisa shook her head. "Days, maybe. The biological changes are accelerating. Plants are already showing significant mutation. Water chemistry is altering rapidly." "We need to disrupt their system," Tom said firmly. "Break the network they're establishing." May stepped forward. "I think I can help with that. The readings I took at the substation gave me insight into their communication protocols. They're advanced, but not impenetrable. If I can build an interference device, we might be able to disrupt their coordination." Margaret considered this. "How soon?" "Give me 12 hours, May replied. "I'll need components, any electronics, batteries, transmission equipment you can find." A flurry of activity followed as survivors searched their belongings for anything that might be useful. People produced smartphones, tablets, portable radios, flashlights, batteries. A surprising amount of technology had survived with the various refugees. May set up a workspace in one of the smaller chambers and began disassembling and repurposing the electronic components. I joined her, offering my knowledge of structural systems to help design a device that could effectively target the alien network. "Their system has nodes and connections just like any engineering project," I explained. "If we can identify critical junction points, we can cause cascading failures throughout the network." Working through the night, we developed a plan. May would build a device that could transmit interference patterns across the frequencies used by the alien craft. I would identify the most vulnerable nodes in their network based on our observations and my understanding of structural weak points. By morning, May had constructed a prototype, a crude but potentially effective transmitter cobbled together from various electronic components. It looked like a bizarre hybrid of smartphone components, radio parts, and battery packs, but she was confident it would work. "It won't stop them," she cautioned, "but it might confuse their automated systems long enough for us to observe how they respond to failures. Knowledge we can use for more effective countermeasures." Margaret approved a test operation. A small team, myself, May, Tom, and Lisa, would place the device near one of the alien ground stations we had observed, activate it remotely, and observe the results from a safe distance. As we prepared for the mission, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the nuclear strikes, a sense of purpose, of actively working against our destruction rather than merely hiding from it. The aliens thought like engineers, approaching our world as a structural problem to be solved. But I was an engineer too. I understood how systems failed, how seemingly minor disruptions could cascade into catastrophic collapse. They might have advanced technology and a systematic plan, but they hadn't accounted for human ingenuity and our capacity for adaptation. Their precision and predictability might actually become their weakness. As I checked my equipment and prepared for the mission, I remembered something a colleague once told me during a particularly challenging demolition project. The most elegant structures often have the most catastrophic failure points. Find the keystone, and the whole thing comes down. We were going to find their keystone, and when we did, their perfect system would start to crumble. Our mission to disrupt the alien network began at dawn. The strange green light that had replaced normal daylight made the landscape look even more alien than before. familiar terrain transformed into something unsettlingly foreign. We exited the mine complex through a different access point than previous missions, emerging from a narrow shaft that opened into a dry creek bed about 6 miles from our target. The ground station we'd selected for our test was one we'd observed during our return from the substation, relatively isolated, positioned in a clearing within a small woodlot. Its isolation made it both a good target and a potential trap. If it was monitored less frequently than nodes near critical infrastructure, we might have more time to observe the effects of our disruption. But isolation also meant we'd be more noticeable if any alien craft were in the area. Our team moved carefully across the countryside. Tom led, using his military training to establish a secure route. May carried the interference device she'd constructed, a jumble of repurposed electronics that looked improvised but represented our best understanding of the alien technology. Lisa monitored environmental conditions, watching for changes in the alien modifications that might indicate increased activity. I focused on structural elements, both natural and man-made, that could provide cover or serve as observation points. The landscape had changed noticeably in just the few days since the alien arrival. Plant life was increasingly distorted, with normal green foliage taking on purplish hues and growth patterns that defied natural biology. Trees twisted in ways that compromised their structural integrity. Even the soil had changed texture and color, becoming darker and slightly crystalline. "The transformation is accelerating," Lisa whispered as we paused in a shallow ravine. "The chemical changes in the soil are happening faster than I anticipated." "Timeline?" Tom asked. Lisa shook her head. "If it continues at this rate, most Earth plants will be unable to survive in a week. Animals shortly after. The air composition is changing too, though more slowly." This information added urgency to our mission. We weren't just gathering intelligence anymore. We were fighting for survival against a systematic, accelerating terraforming process. We reached our observation position about 400 yards from the alien ground station. The device was even more impressive in daylight. A complex structure with multiple extending components burrowed into the earth and reaching skyward. It pulsed with that same purplish energy we'd observed at the substation, evidently tapping into and converting local energy sources for its operation. Tom surveyed the area through binoculars. "No craft in sight. Seems unguarded." "They don't need guards," I pointed out. "Their network allows them to monitor everything remotely." "Which is exactly what we're trying to disrupt," May added, making final adjustments to her device. She explained the plan again. "I'll approach to within 200 yards. Close enough for the signal to reach the station, but hopefully not close enough to trigger immediate response. The transmitter will send out interference patterns across the frequencies they're using, creating what amounts to static in their communications." "What do you expect to happen?" Lisa asked. "Best case? The node loses connection to the wider network and enters some kind of diagnostic or reset mode. Worst case? Nothing noticeable, but we learn more about their systems from how they don't respond." "There's another worst case," Tom said grimly. "They trace the interference instantly, and we have alien craft converging on our position." May nodded. "Hence the remote activation and our healthy distance from the transmitter. We established positions that gave us good sight lines to both the alien station and the area where May would place her device. Tom would provide security, watching for approaching craft. Lisa would observe environmental reactions. If the station's operations affected the surrounding area, disrupting it might cause visible changes. I would focus on the station itself, looking for structural responses or changes in operation. May moved forward alone, carrying the transmitter. She kept low, using the altered vegetation for cover. When she reached her predetermined position, a fallen tree about 200 yards from the station, she carefully placed the device, activated its standby mode, and retreated to our position. "Ready," she reported, slightly out of breath from the careful movement. "Remote activation whenever we're set." We performed final checks of our observation equipment. May had a modified tablet displaying signal data. Lisa had environmental sensors. I had binoculars focused on the station's structural components. Tom kept his attention split between the sky and surrounding terrain. "Activating in 3, 2, 1, May whispered, tapping her tablet. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then, almost too subtle to notice at first, the pulsing rhythm of the station changed. The purple energy emissions became slightly erratic, fluctuating in intensity rather than maintaining a steady output. "It's working," May whispered excitedly. "The interference is affecting their signal coherence." I focused my binoculars on the structural components of the station. The ground attachments are losing synchronization. They're designed to pulse in sequence, but the pattern is breaking down. Lisa was monitoring her sensors. Energy output is fluctuating. Whatever they're doing to modify the environment is becoming inconsistent. For several minutes, the disruption continued, with the station's operations becoming increasingly erratic. Then, something unexpected happened. A section of the station that had been anchored in the ground retracted suddenly, withdrawing into the main structure. "It's reconfiguring," I observed, "adapting to the interference." May adjusted something on her tablet. "Changing our signal pattern. Let's see how it responds to that." The station's behavior changed again. This time, instead of retracting components, it extended new ones, different in design from those that had been operating previously. The purple energy emissions stabilized briefly, then began fluctuating in a different pattern. "It's switching to backup systems," May interpreted, "like a computer trying alternative network connections when the primary one fails." "Can you block those too?" Tom asked, still scanning the sky. "Trying," May replied, fingers moving across her tablet. "But it's adapting faster than I expected." The station continued to reconfigure, cycling through what appeared to be multiple operational modes. Then, abruptly, it emitted a bright pulse of energy that expanded outward in a visible wave. "Signal flare," May said, alarmed. "It's calling for help." Almost immediately, we heard the high-pitched whine of approaching alien craft. Tom spotted them first, two smaller craft approaching rapidly from the direction of Minneapolis. "Time to go," he said urgently. "Leave the transmitter. We've seen enough." We gathered our observation equipment and began withdrawing, moving quickly but carefully to avoid exposing ourselves. The alien craft arrived at the station within minutes, hovering over it and emitting scanning beams that swept the surrounding area. We had reached the edge of the woodlot when one of the scanning beams passed overhead. We froze, pressing ourselves against the earth beneath a tangle of distorted vegetation. The beam swept back, more slowly this time, focusing on our general area. They had detected something. Perhaps not us specifically, but something that warranted investigation. "They're zeroing in," Tom whispered. "We need to split up. Multiple targets, multiple directions." It was a standard military tactic. Divide the enemy's attention. We quickly agreed on a rendezvous point about 2 miles away, then separated, each taking a different escape route. I moved westward, using a shallow drainage ditch for cover. Behind me, I could hear the alien craft changing position, their scanning beams intensifying. They had definitely detected something. I kept moving, staying low in the ditch until it ended at a culvert passing beneath a rural road. The culvert was narrow, barely 2 feet in diameter, but large enough for me to squeeze through. I entered it, crawling on my stomach through stagnant water and debris. Emerging on the other side, I found myself in a field of corn, or what had once been corn. The plants had transformed under alien influence, stalks twisted into spiral formations with purplish husks containing something that definitely wasn't corn. The distorted plants provided excellent cover, however, as I continued moving away from the alien craft. After about 15 minutes of careful movement, I reached the edge of another woodlot. I paused there, assessing the terrain ahead and listening for pursuers. The alien craft weren't visible from my position, but I could still hear their distinctive whine in the distance. I continued through the woods, angling toward our rendezvous point. The forest showed even more dramatic transformation than the fields. Trees fused together in unnatural configurations, undergrowth glowing faintly with bioluminescent properties that hadn't been present days before. When I reached the rendezvous point, an abandoned barn about 2 miles from the alien station, Lisa was already there. She looked shaken but unharmed. "They followed me for about half a mile," she reported, then veered off toward something else. "I think they found May's transmitter." Within minutes, Tom arrived, moving with the careful precision of someone used to evading pursuit. "They're conducting a systematic search pattern," he informed us, "grid by grid, but they seem more interested in the technology than pursuing us directly." We waited anxiously for May. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Tom was preparing to go look for her when she finally appeared, approaching from an unexpected direction. "Sorry," she said, slightly out of breath. "Had to take a very roundabout route. They were particularly interested in my tablet. I think they detected the control signals I was sending to the transmitter." With our team reunited, we began the longer journey back to the mine complex. We traveled cautiously, taking a circuitous route and stopping frequently to check for pursuit. The alien craft remained active in the area around the ground station but didn't appear to be expanding their search to our current location. As we traveled, we discussed what we'd learned from the operation. "Their systems are adaptive," May observed. "They recognized the interference and reconfigured to counter it. But there was a delay, a processing time before adaptation. That suggests some limitations in their autonomous responses." "The structural reconfiguration was interesting," I added. "It wasn't random. There was an engineered sequence to how it responded to failure, like a building designed to channel stress away from critical support points during an earthquake. The environmental effects fluctuated when the station's operations were disrupted," Lisa noted. "Whatever they're doing to transform the landscape, it requires continuous energy input. Interrupt that, and the process slows." Tom summed up the tactical implications. "So we can disrupt them temporarily, but they adapt quickly, and they can call for reinforcements when threatened." "We need to think bigger," I suggested. "If we're going to have any meaningful impact, we need to target multiple nodes simultaneously. Create system-wide disruption rather than localized interference." The idea took root as we continued toward the mine complex. A coordinated attack on multiple nodes might overload their adaptive capabilities, force them to spread their response resources too thin, but it would require more transmitters, more teams, and perfect timing. We reached the mine entrance as darkness was falling. The strange green luminescence in the sky had intensified, now accompanied by shifting patterns of light that resembled auroras but with unnatural coloration. Margaret met us inside, eager for our report. We explained what had happened, the partial success of the disruption, the station's adaptive response, our narrow escape from the alien craft. "They're vulnerable to our interference," May emphasized. "Not permanently, but enough to matter. If we could coordinate simultaneous disruptions across multiple nodes, we might be able to create significant problems for their network." Margaret considered this. "How many transmitters would you need to build?" "At least 5, ideally more. And we'd need teams to place them near critical nodes in their network." Dr. Chen joined the conversation. "Based on what you've described, I think I understand more about their overall strategy. They're creating a resonance network, each node strengthening the others, amplifying the environmental transformation effects. Disrupt enough nodes simultaneously, and the entire network might become unstable. The implications were significant. We might not be able to stop the alien terraforming entirely, but we could potentially slow it, buy time for more humans to seek shelter, or for military forces to organize resistance. As plans began forming for a larger disruption operation, Robert approached with news from his reconnaissance team. "We've detected increased activity around Minneapolis," he reported. "More of the larger craft arriving. And something new. They appear to be establishing a perimeter around the city, placing larger versions of their ground stations at regular intervals. Consolidating control of the area they've already transformed," Dr. Chen suggested, "creating a secure zone before expanding further." "Or preparing for the next phase," I added, thinking about the engineering sequence of large-scale projects. "Site preparation is complete. Now they're moving to primary construction." Margaret looked concerned. "How long before they expand the perimeter to include our location?" Robert shook his head. "Hard to say. At their current rate of expansion, perhaps 4 or 5 days. Then we need to act quickly," Margaret decided. "May, how fast can you build those transmitters?" "With enough parts and help, maybe 48 hours. You'll have whatever you need. Everyone with technical skills will assist you." The next day became a flurry of activity. Survivors with any experience in electronics or engineering joined May in constructing multiple interference transmitters. I worked with Dr. Chen to analyze the alien network based on our observations, identifying critical nodes that would be our primary targets. Tom and Robert organized reconnaissance teams to gather up-to-date intelligence on alien positions and movements. Lisa continued monitoring environmental changes, providing increasingly alarming reports on the acceleration of the terraforming process. By evening, we had a preliminary plan. 5 teams would deploy to different locations around the perimeter of alien control, each placing a transmitter near a critical node. The transmitters would activate simultaneously, creating widespread disruption across their network. A 6th team would observe the central structure over Minneapolis, looking for signs of how the aliens would respond to a system-wide failure. As I reviewed the engineering aspects of the plan, I noticed something in the pattern of alien ground stations that had eluded me before. They weren't positioned in a simple grid. There was a subtle geometric progression to their placement, like a spiral emanating from the central structure over Minneapolis. "They're creating a fractal pattern," I realized, showing Dr. Chen my analysis. Each node positioned to maximize resonance with adjacent nodes, creating a self-reinforcing energy pattern. Dr. Chen studied my calculations. "If you're right, then disrupting specific nodes at these junction points would have a disproportionate effect on the entire network." We refined our targets based on this insight, focusing on nodes that served as key junction points in the fractal pattern. The plan was taking shape, a coordinated strike against the geometric foundations of their terraforming network. That night, as others slept or continued preparations, I found myself unable to rest. I wandered the mine tunnels, thinking about what we were facing. The aliens approached Earth as an engineering project, systematic, efficient, precise. They thought like I did, viewing problems in terms of structural integrity, stress points, and system optimization, which meant I could anticipate their responses, predict their adaptations. If we disrupted their carefully designed system, they would follow standard engineering protocols, isolate failures, implement redundancies, restore critical functions first. But what if we didn't attack the obvious targets? What if we targeted seemingly peripheral nodes that actually served as key stabilizing elements in their fractal pattern? Like removing specific support columns in a building that appears secondary but actually distribute critical loads. With this new perspective, I returned to our planning area and began reworking the analysis. By morning, I had identified 5 targets that didn't appear significant in isolation, but served as crucial stability points in their overall network. I presented my revised analysis to Margaret, Dr. Chen, and the team leaders. These nodes appear less important than the major ground stations, which means they might be less defended, but they're actually critical to maintaining stability across the entire fractal pattern. Dr. Chen verified my calculations. He's right. These positions serve as harmonic anchors in their resonance network. Disrupt these simultaneously, and the entire pattern could become unstable. Margaret approved the revised targets. We deploy tomorrow at dawn. 5 teams, 5 targets. Synchronized disruption. As preparations continued throughout the day, I worked with each team to ensure they understood exactly why their specific target was important and what to look for when the disruption began. It wasn't enough to simply place the transmitters. We needed to observe and document the effects to refine our understanding of the alien system. By nightfall, everything was ready. The 5 transmitters were complete. Each team had their assignments, and emergency extraction plans were in place. We would all deploy from different exit points, converge on our targets, and activate the transmitters at precisely the same time. As I prepared my equipment for the morning mission, Tom joined me. He would be leading one of the other teams. "You know this is just the beginning," he said quietly. "Even if this works perfectly, we're just buying time." I nodded. Time is what we need. Time to understand them better, to find more fundamental weaknesses. And if we don't? I considered the question seriously. As an engineer, I was trained to analyze problems objectively, to calculate probabilities and outcomes without emotional bias. "Then we've still done something important," I replied. "We've proven they're not invincible, that humans can adapt and resist even against vastly superior technology." Tom smiled slightly. "Not bad for a demolition expert and a handful of survivors." "That's the thing about demolition," I told him. "You learn that even the most impressive structures have vulnerable points. Apply the right pressure in the right place, and the whole thing comes down." As he left to complete his own preparations, I returned to checking my equipment. Tomorrow would test that theory against an alien intelligence that had crossed interstellar space to remake our world in their image. They might have advanced technology and a perfect plan, but they hadn't accounted for human ingenuity and determination. They hadn't accounted for a demolition expert who understood precisely how things fall apart. Dawn broke with that now familiar sickly green luminescence that had replaced normal daylight. My team, consisting of myself, Lisa, and a former utility worker named Darren, exited the mine complex through a ventilation shaft that emerged in a wooded hillside about 7 miles from our target node. The other 4 teams had departed through different exits, each heading toward their assigned targets. Our destination was what appeared to be a minor node in the alien network, a smaller ground station positioned near an abandoned grain silo. According to my fractal analysis, this unassuming station served as a crucial harmonic anchor in their resonance pattern, helping stabilize the entire network. Disrupt it simultaneously with the other 4 anchor points, and the whole system might experience cascading instability. We moved carefully through the transformed landscape, staying under cover whenever possible. The environmental changes had accelerated dramatically in the past day. Trees now grew in spiral formations, their bark crystalline and translucent. The ground itself had a subtle purple sheen, as if infused with some alien mineral. Even the air felt different, heavier, with an electrical quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. "The oxygen content is dropping," Lisa reported, checking a small sensor she carried. "Down about 3% from Earth normal. Nitrogen compounds are increasing." "Still breathable?" I asked. She nodded. For now. But the trend line suggests we have maybe 5 days before it becomes difficult for humans to function without supplemental oxygen. 5 days. The timeline kept shrinking. What had seemed like a gradual transformation was accelerating toward some critical threshold. We reached our observation position about half a mile from the target node shortly before 9 in the morning. The alien ground station was smaller than the ones we'd observed previously, perhaps the size of a small car rather than the van-sized units near major infrastructure. It still maintained the same basic design, components burrowed into the earth, others extending skyward, all pulsing with that distinctive purple energy. "Looks unguarded," Darren observed through binoculars. "No craft in the immediate area." "They don't need physical guards," I reminded him. "Their network is their security system." We established our position in an abandoned farm outbuilding that gave us good sight lines to the alien device while providing structural cover. According to our synchronized schedule, all 5 teams would place their transmitters and activate them precisely at 11 o'clock. Lisa continued monitoring environmental conditions while Darren and I prepared the transmitter. May had made improvements to the design based on what we'd learned from our first test. This version had multiple frequency options, allowing it to adapt if the aliens attempted to switch communications channels. "Radiation levels are interesting," Lisa noted, studying her sensors. "There's background radiation from the nuclear exchange as expected. But these alien devices seem to be absorbing it somehow. The levels are lower near their stations than in surrounding areas. That was unexpected. They're using the radiation? Converting it? Possibly. It would be an efficient approach. Repurpose the residual energy from our weapons as a power source for their terraforming." This insight gave me pause. If they were utilizing radiation, disrupting their network might actually increase local radiation levels temporarily, something to be aware of during our operation. At 10:30, I moved forward alone to place the transmitter. We'd selected a position about 200 yards from the alien device, close enough for our signal to be effective, but hopefully beyond immediate detection range. The location was a drainage culvert that provided both concealment and a clear line of sight to the target. I crawled through tall, transformed grass, carrying the transmitter in a backpack. The vegetation had a strange texture, simultaneously brittle and spongy, nothing like normal plant matter. It made small crystalline sounds when disturbed, forcing me to move with extreme caution. Reaching the culvert, I carefully positioned the transmitter, orienting its antenna toward the alien device. I set the activation timer to synchronize with our 11 o'clock schedule, then began my withdrawal. Halfway back to our observation post, I heard it, the high-pitched whine of an alien craft approaching. I immediately dropped flat, pressing myself into the transformed vegetation. The sound grew louder, and through the strange plants I could see a small alien craft moving methodically across the area, following what appeared to be a routine patrol pattern. The craft wasn't heading directly toward either the transmitter or my position, but its path would take it close enough that detection was a concern. I remained motionless, controlling my breathing, watching as it moved across my field of vision. The craft maintained its programmed route, passing about 100 yards from my position without deviation. Once it had moved beyond visual range, I continued my careful return to the observation post. "Patrol craft," I reported upon rejoining Lisa and Darren. "Seems routine, not responding to any detection." "They're becoming more frequent," Darren noted. "We've observed 3 different patrol routes converging in this area since establishing position." That was concerning. Increased patrol activity might indicate the aliens were heightening security around nodes we had identified as structurally significant. Perhaps their network analysis had reached similar conclusions about vulnerable points. As 11 o'clock approached, we prepared our observation equipment. Lisa's environmental sensors were recording baseline data that would help us understand how the disruption affected the terraforming process. Darren had a modified camera to document visual changes. I focused on structural responses, how the physical components of the alien device would react to our interference. 30 seconds, Lisa whispered, checking her watch. We watched in tense silence as the final moments ticked away. At precisely 11, our transmitter activated, right on schedule. Almost immediately, the alien device's pulsing rhythm changed, becoming erratic and inconsistent. It's working, Darren confirmed, recording the effects. Same response pattern as our test run. But this time, something different happened. Instead of simply fluctuating, the purple energy emission suddenly intensified, becoming almost blindingly bright. The device's physical components began moving rapidly, reconfiguring in ways we hadn't observed before. It's going into some kind of emergency mode, I analyzed. A more aggressive adaptation than what we saw during the test. Lisa checked her sensors. Energy output is spiking dramatically. And something else, there's a harmonic wave propagating through the ground. I think it's trying to communicate with adjacent nodes using the Earth itself as a medium. That made sense from an engineering perspective. If conventional communications were being disrupted, fall back to more primitive but reliable methods, like seismic vibrations. The alien device continued its rapid reconfiguration, extending new components and retracting others. Then, without warning, it emitted a brilliant pulse of energy that expanded outward in all directions, similar to the signal flare we'd witnessed during our test, but much more powerful. It's calling for help, Darren said, lowering his camera. And I'm guessing it's not just calling the patrol craft. Almost immediately, we detected multiple alien craft approaching from different directions. But more concerning was what happened next. The ground around the device began to change, the already transformed soil and vegetation taking on a more intensely crystalline quality. The transformation was visibly accelerating in the immediate vicinity of the node. It's diverting energy to increase localized terraforming, Lisa realized, checking her sensors. Radiation levels are spiking too. It's converting more background radiation to power this acceleration. This was an unexpected defense mechanism. Rather than simply calling for help or adapting its communications, the device was intensifying its primary function, transforming Earth's environment into something increasingly hostile to human life. We need to move, I decided. The patrol craft will be here any minute, and the environmental changes are becoming dangerous. We gathered our observation equipment and began withdrawing, moving away from both the alien device and our transmitter. Behind us, the transformation continued to accelerate, a visible wave of purple-tinged crystallization spreading outward from the node. As we retreated through increasingly altered terrain, we could hear multiple alien craft converging on the area. They moved with greater urgency than we'd observed previously, suggesting our coordinated attack had genuinely disrupted their operations. We had traveled about half a mile when the ground beneath us suddenly vibrated with a powerful harmonic pulse, different from the regular scanning vibrations we'd experienced before. This was stronger, more focused. They're using the ground itself to re-establish network communications, I realized, bypassing our electromagnetic interference. Will it work? Darren asked. Partially. Seismic communication is slower and less precise, but it's much harder to disrupt. We continued moving away from the area, angling toward our extraction route. The alien craft were now clearly visible in the sky above our former position, hovering over both their device and our abandoned transmitter. Then something unexpected happened. In the distance, toward Minneapolis, a brilliant purple beam shot skyward from what had to be the central alien structure, a massive surge of energy visible even from miles away. That's not good, Lisa said quietly. They're powering up the central hub, probably to compensate for the disruption in the network nodes. As we continued our withdrawal, similar energy beams appeared on the horizon in multiple directions, presumably from other major nodes in their network. The aliens were clearly implementing system-wide countermeasures to our disruption. We reached our planned extraction route, a small stream that ran through a culvert beneath a rural road, leading eventually to one of the mine complex entrances. As we moved along the stream bed, I tried to analyze what we were witnessing. The aliens had responded to our coordinated attack with multiple adaptive strategies: localized terraforming acceleration, alternative communication methods, and power redistribution across their network. It was exactly how a well-designed system should respond to localized failures: isolate damaged sections, implement redundancies, and reroute critical functions. From an engineering perspective, it was impressive, but it also revealed something important. They had contingency plans, which meant they anticipated resistance, which meant our actions weren't entirely unexpected. We reached the culvert and paused to rest briefly before continuing through it. Lisa checked her environmental sensors again. "The atmospheric changes have accelerated dramatically in the past hour," she reported. "Oxygen levels down another % just since we left our observation post. And there are new compounds appearing that weren't present before." "They're pushing toward some kind of threshold," I suggested. "Our disruption forced them to accelerate their timeline." "Is that good or bad for us?" Darren asked. "Both. They're using more resources, potentially creating inefficiencies we can exploit. But they're also making Earth uninhabitable for humans faster than we anticipated." We continued through the culvert and along our extraction route, eventually reaching the mine entrance by mid-afternoon. Other teams were already returning, sharing similar observations about the alien response to our coordinated disruption. Margaret convened a debriefing session once all teams had returned. Each team reported the same basic pattern: initial disruption of the targeted node, followed by adaptation, energy surges, and accelerated terraforming in the immediate vicinity. "They compensated faster than we expected," May acknowledged, "but they definitely felt it. The energy surge from the central structure proves we forced them to implement emergency protocols." Dr. Chen was analyzing the combined data from all 5 operations. "The fractal pattern analysis was correct," he confirmed, looking at me. "The harmonic anchors were indeed critical to network stability. But they had redundancies we didn't anticipate." Tom's team had been observing the central structure over Minneapolis during the operation. His report was particularly concerning. "After the initial disruption, we observed a massive increase in activity around the central hub. More of the larger craft, the piloted ones, arriving and departing. And the structure itself seemed to be extending downward, establishing deeper connections with the ground." "They're accelerating their timeline," I suggested. "Our disruption forced them to implement the next phase of their project earlier than planned." Robert's team had managed to get closer to one of the major nodes than expected. "They're definitely using radiation as a power source," he reported. "We recorded significant decreases in background radiation levels near their devices, corresponding with increases in their energy output." This confirmed Lisa's observations and suggested another potential vulnerability. If they were harvesting radiation, perhaps they had specific requirements or limitations in how they processed it. As the debriefing continued, a pattern emerged from our collective observations. The alien network was impressive in its adaptability but followed predictable engineering principles. Their responses to failure were systematic and prioritized overall network stability over individual node functionality. "They think collectively," Dr. Chen observed. "Each component subordinates itself to the needs of the whole system." "Like a hive mind?" someone suggested. "More like a well-designed infrastructure network," I countered. distributed intelligence with centralized coordination, similar to how our power grids or telecommunications networks operate, but more advanced. This insight gave me an idea. In human-designed networks, there was always a trade-off between efficiency and resilience. The most efficient systems were often the most vulnerable to cascading failures if key nodes were compromised simultaneously. We need to target the coordination mechanism, I suggested. Not just the individual nodes, but whatever allows them to synchronize their activities across the network. May looked thoughtful. The energy pulses we observed. They were transmitting information as well as power. If we could interfere with that specific frequency pattern, we'd need to get much closer to the central structure, Tom pointed out. The coordination signals are strongest there. The conversation continued as we analyzed the data and considered our next steps. Our first coordinated attack had yielded valuable information, but hadn't significantly slowed the alien terraforming. If anything, it had accelerated their timeline. As night fell, the strange luminescence in the sky intensified. New patterns appeared, swirling vortices of greenish-purple light that resembled auroras but moved with unnatural precision. Through the mine entrance, we could see these lights reflecting off the transformed landscape, creating an eerily beautiful but alien world. I found myself standing at the entrance, studying these atmospheric changes, when Margaret joined me. "How long do we have?" she asked quietly. I considered everything we had observed. At the current rate of atmospheric transformation, perhaps 4 days before humans can't survive on the surface without specialized equipment. Longer underground, but eventually the changes will reach us here too. She nodded, having clearly expected this answer. Then we need a more decisive strategy than just disruption. "I've been thinking about that," I replied. "They're using our nuclear radiation as a power source. There might be a way to turn that against them." "How?" "I'm not sure yet. But they're clearly sensitive to radiation in specific ways. They're harvesting it, transforming it, which means they have a relationship with it that we might be able to exploit." Margaret considered this. The military remnants we've been in contact with have mentioned establishing a secure zone in the Dakota Black Hills. Underground facilities, radiation shielding, supplies. They're gathering survivors there. "That's over 300 miles from here," I noted. "Yes, but they also mentioned having access to certain resources. Nuclear materials, research facilities." She looked at me meaningfully. "If your theory about exploiting the aliens' relationship with radiation has merit, they might have what we need to develop it further." I understood what she was suggesting. Our small group couldn't win this fight alone. We needed to connect with other survivors, pool knowledge and resources. "How would we get there?" I asked. "The surface is becoming increasingly hostile, and they control the skies." "Underground," she replied simply. "There are old mine systems, utility tunnels, natural cave formations. Not a continuous path, but enough segments that we could minimize surface exposure." The engineer in me immediately began calculating the feasibility. It would be challenging, but not impossible. My knowledge of subterranean structures would be valuable for such a journey. "We should send a small team first," I suggested. "Establish the route, make contact, determine if it's worth moving the entire group." Margaret nodded. "That's what I was thinking. You, May, and Tom have the right combination of skills: technical knowledge, adaptive thinking, combat experience. When? Tomorrow. The longer we wait, the more difficult surface transit becomes." As she left me to consider this new mission, I turned back to the alien light show in the sky. Whatever they were doing to our atmosphere was accelerating. The transformation that had seemed gradual just days ago was now visibly progressing hour by hour. We were running out of time, not just our small group in the limestone mines, but humanity as a whole. The aliens were methodically converting Earth into something that could support their biology at the expense of our own. But in their methodical approach, in their engineering precision, I continued to see potential vulnerabilities. They were following a program, implementing a design. And all designs, no matter how elegant, have failure points. As a demolition expert, I had spent my career identifying those failure points, understanding exactly how structures collapse. Now I needed to apply that knowledge to something far more complex, an alien terraforming system remaking our entire planet. The solution would involve radiation somehow. I was increasingly certain of that. The way they harvested it, converted it, utilized it. There was a relationship there we didn't fully understand yet, but which might hold the key to disrupting their entire project. Tomorrow we would begin the journey to find others who might help us exploit that relationship. A dangerous journey through a world being transformed around us, beneath skies that no longer belong to Earth. But first, I needed to prepare, to gather everything I knew about structural vulnerabilities, radiation effects, and system failures. Because if we found a way to strike at the heart of their terraforming project, we would only get one chance to execute it correctly. Preparation for our journey began immediately. Margaret explained our mission to the rest of the survivors. Our small team would establish a route to the military stronghold in the Black Hills, determine what resources they had, and evaluate whether moving the entire group there was feasible. The rest would continue fortifying the mine complex and gathering what information they could about the accelerating alien terraforming. Tom, May, and I spent the night gathering equipment and studying maps. Robert provided us with detailed information about the terrain between our location and the Black Hills, highlighting potential underground passages we could use. Dr. Chen and Lisa prepared environmental sensors for us to monitor atmospheric conditions along our route. Your theory about radiation is our best lead, Dr. Chen told me as he helped assemble our gear. The way they're harvesting it suggests a specific relationship, perhaps a vulnerability, or perhaps it's exactly what they came for, I suggested, a new thought forming. What if the nuclear exchange wasn't just a convenient weakening of our defenses? What if the radiation itself was the resource they wanted? Dr. Chen looked startled by this perspective. You think they engineered the nuclear war specifically to create radiation sources? It would explain their immediate arrival afterward, and why they're focusing on areas with the highest radiation readings. This theory filled me with equal parts horror and hope. Horror at the calculation involved, manipulating humanity into devastating itself to produce a resource they desired. Hope because it suggested a specific vulnerability we might exploit. By dawn, we were ready. Our packs contained 3 days of supplies, radiation detection equipment, maps, communication devices, and May's latest version of the interference transmitter. Tom carried a hunting rifle with limited ammunition, a last resort rather than a primary defense. Margaret addressed us before we departed. Your mission is intelligence gathering primarily. Establish contact, assess resources, determine feasibility of mass evacuation. Do not engage the aliens unless absolutely necessary. We exited the mine complex through a ventilation shaft that emerged in a ravine about 10 miles south of our previous operations. This route would take us initially southward, away from the heaviest alien activity around Minneapolis, before turning west toward the Black Hills. The world outside had transformed even further overnight. The vegetation now bore little resemblance to earth plants, twisted crystalline structures that pulsed with internal energy. The ground itself had a glassy, purple-tinged quality that reflected the strange atmospheric light. Even the air felt wrong, thinner, with an electrical charge that made each breath slightly painful. Lisa's environmental sensors had been accurate. Oxygen levels were dropping while unknown compounds increased. We had perhaps 3 days before the atmosphere became toxic to humans without protective equipment. We moved carefully, staying under cover whenever possible. Tom led, using his military training to establish a secure path. May monitored our electronic equipment, watching for signs of alien detection technology. I focused on identifying underground access points, drainage systems, utility tunnels, natural formations that might provide safer passage. After several hours of cautious progress, we reached our first major underground segment, an abandoned railway tunnel that would allow us to travel nearly 30 miles beneath the surface. The tunnel entrance was partially collapsed, but still passable. Structural integrity looks reasonable, I assessed, examining the support beams. Some stress fractures, but nothing immediately concerning. We entered the tunnel, switching on headlamps to navigate the darkness. The temperature dropped immediately, a welcome relief from the increasingly alien environment outside. The tunnel showed signs of age but remained largely intact, its concrete and steel construction having weathered the decades well. "How did you know about this?" May asked as we moved deeper into the passage. "Part of my job," I explained. "Structural assessment includes understanding all underground infrastructure that might affect surface stability. I've surveyed dozens of abandoned tunnels, mines, and utility passages throughout the region." This knowledge was proving invaluable now. As we progressed through the tunnel, I could identify stress points, potential failure zones, and structural adaptations that would be necessary if the entire survivor group attempted this route. After about 10 miles, we encountered our first significant obstacle, a tunnel collapse that completely blocked our path. The ceiling had failed, bringing down tons of earth and concrete across the tracks. "End of the line?" Tom asked, examining the collapse. I studied the debris carefully, assessing the structural implications. Not necessarily. The maintenance passages might still be intact. Along the sides of many railway tunnels, especially older ones, narrow maintenance corridors provided access for workers to reach equipment without walking on the tracks. I located one such passage behind a partially collapsed access door. "It's tight, but passable," I reported after examining the space. The structural failure was concentrated on the main tunnel. These secondary passages were built into the bedrock itself. We squeezed through the maintenance corridor, a cramped space barely 3 feet wide and 6 feet high. The passage was dusty but structurally sound, allowing us to bypass the main collapse. After about a quarter mile, we were able to return to the main tunnel beyond the obstruction. We continued through the railway tunnel until reaching its western terminus around mid-afternoon. The exit emerged in a rural area that had once been farmland, but now looked like an alien landscape. The transformation of the environment had progressed even further here, with what appeared to be new life forms developing, pulsing, crystalline structures that defied classification as either plant or animal. "Oxygen levels critical," May reported, checking our sensors. "Down to 15%, and the new atmospheric compounds are increasing rapidly." We needed to find another underground passage quickly. According to our maps, a natural cave system should be accessible about 5 miles northwest of our position. We moved carefully across the transformed terrain, staying low and using the crystalline formations for cover. As we traveled, the strange sky continued to change. The greenish luminescence had developed structured patterns, geometric shapes that shifted and flowed with unnatural precision. It wasn't just atmosphere anymore. It was something else entirely, something deliberately engineered. We were about halfway to the cave system when Tom signaled for us to stop and take cover. In the distance, a larger alien craft was descending toward what appeared to be a newly established ground station. Unlike the smaller automated craft we'd encountered previously, this one moved with purpose and intention, clearly piloted rather than programmed. We watched from concealment as the craft landed beside the ground station, a section of its hull reconfigured, opening to allow something to emerge. For the first time, we saw one of them, the architects of Earth's transformation. The alien form was difficult to comprehend fully. It moved with fluid grace, but had a structural complexity that suggested both biological and technological components integrated seamlessly. Its body appeared both solid and semi-transparent simultaneously, with internal lights pulsing in patterns similar to their ground stations. It was neither humanoid nor entirely foreign, more like an evolutionary path that diverged from Earth life millions of years ago, developing along entirely different principles. It approached the ground station and interfaced with it directly, its body seemingly merging partially with the technology. The station's energy patterns changed, becoming more coherent and intense. The transformation of the surrounding environment visibly accelerated, crystalline structures growing and changing before our eyes. "They're not just terraforming remotely," May whispered, "they're actively participating in the process." "And accelerating it," I added, noting the rapid environmental changes. "This confirms they're pushing towards some kind of threshold faster than originally planned." We remained hidden, observing as the alien continued its work. After about 20 minutes, it separated from the ground station, returned to its craft, and ascended back into the atmospheric disturbance. Once it was clear, we continued toward the cave system, moving more urgently now. The atmospheric changes were accelerating, making each breath more labored. By the time we reached the cave entrance, my lungs were burning from the thinning oxygen and unknown compounds. The cave opening was partially obscured by transformed vegetation, but remained accessible. We entered gratefully, moving deep enough to escape the alien atmosphere before stopping to rest and assess our situation. "That changes things," Tom said once we were safely inside. "If they're personally supervising the transformation now, they must be nearing completion. Or responding to our disruption efforts," May suggested. "We forced them to adapt their timeline." I was thinking about what we'd witnessed, the direct interface between alien and technology, the seamless integration of biological and mechanical components. They don't distinguish between living and non-living systems the way we do, I realized. Their technology is an extension of themselves, not separate. This insight shed new light on their approach to terraforming. They weren't just changing Earth's environment, they were integrating with it, establishing a system where technology, biology, and geology functioned as a unified whole. We rested briefly, then continued deeper into the cave system. Unlike the railway tunnel, these natural passages were irregular and often challenging to navigate. I led the way, using my knowledge of geological formations to identify the most stable routes. The cave system extended for miles beneath the surface, occasionally intersecting with abandoned mining operations from the early 20th century. These human-made tunnels provided more direct routes when available, though many had collapsed over the decades. As we progressed westward through this subterranean maze, our headlamps illuminated a startling sight. The cave walls themselves were beginning to change. Crystalline formations similar to those on the surface were growing from the rock, pulsing with faint internal light. "The transformation is reaching underground," May observed, examining the crystals without touching them. "Not as advanced as on the surface, but definitely happening." This was concerning. We had assumed underground spaces would remain safe longer than the surface, but the alien influence was penetrating deeper than expected. Our timeline for maintaining habitable spaces for humans was shrinking rapidly. We continued through the increasingly transformed cave system, eventually reaching a junction where the natural passages met a more recent human excavation, a utility tunnel for water mains connecting rural communities. This tunnel was concrete-lined and relatively modern, providing easier passage for several miles. The utility tunnel eventually led us to a small underground pump station where we could rest more comfortably. The facility had emergency supplies, including water and some preserved food. Most importantly, it had a sealed environment with filtered air, temporary relief from the increasingly toxic atmosphere. While Tom secured the perimeter, May set up our communication equipment, attempting to establish contact with either the mine complex we'd left or the military stronghold ahead. I examined the structure, assessing its stability and how long it might remain habitable as the alien transformation progressed. "I'm getting something," May announced after several minutes of adjusting her equipment. "Military frequencies, heavily encrypted, but definitely human." She worked with the radio, fine-tuning the signal until a voice emerged through static. The transmission was fragmented but unmistakably military protocol, coded coordinates, status reports, operational directives. "Can you respond?" Tom asked, joining us. May shook her head. "Receive only with this equipment. But I can triangulate their position based on signal strength." She plotted the coordinates on our map. "They're broadcasting from here, an old missile command bunker about 40 miles northeast of the Black Hills facility. Seems to be a forward operating base." This was valuable information. If military units were establishing multiple strongholds, there might be more organized resistance than we had assumed. Perhaps even a coordinated response to the alien presence. As night fell outside, we took turns resting while maintaining watch. The pump station remained secure, its concrete walls and filtered air system providing a small haven in the increasingly alien world. Through a ventilation shaft, we could see the night sky, now completely transformed, with the structured patterns of light pulsing in geometric synchronization. During my watch, I reviewed everything we had learned about the alien technology and terraforming process. Their integration of biological and mechanical systems, their utilization of radiation, their acceleration toward some threshold point, all pieces of a puzzle I was trying to solve. The radiation connection remained our most promising lead. They were harvesting it, converting it for their purposes, which suggested they had a specific relationship with it, perhaps dependence, perhaps sensitivity, either way, a potential vulnerability. I thought about the mining operation where our survivor group had taken shelter. Limestone mines. Limestone is primarily calcium carbonate, an excellent radiation-shielding material. Was that significant? Did the aliens avoid such areas because their detection systems were less effective there, or because the material itself was somehow incompatible with their transformation process? These questions occupied my mind throughout the night. By morning, according to our watches, since natural daylight cycles no longer existed, I had developed a theory that might explain their approach and potentially identify a vulnerability. When Tom and May awoke, I shared my thinking. I believe they're using radiation to catalyze molecular restructuring at a fundamental level, not just terraforming the surface, but changing the basic chemical interactions that define Earth's environment. Changing the rules of chemistry itself. May looked skeptical. Not entirely, but shifting the equilibrium, making Earth's environment more conducive to their form of life while less supportive of ours. Tom considered this. How does that help us? If radiation is their catalyst, then understanding exactly how they use it might reveal a way to disrupt the process. Not just temporarily, but fundamentally. Before we could discuss further, May's equipment detected movement on the surface above us, multiple signals approaching the pump station's location. "Patrol craft," she confirmed, checking her sensors. "At least 3, converging on this position." We quickly gathered our gear, preparing to move deeper into the tunnel system. Had they detected our presence specifically, or was this a systematic search pattern? Either way, remaining at the pump station was no longer safe. As we prepared to leave, A new sound reached us through the ventilation shaft, a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the Earth. Different from the scanning vibrations we'd experienced before, this was stronger, more focused. "What is that?" Tom asked, his hand on his weapon. I recognized the pattern from my structural analysis. Resonance mapping. They're using sound waves to create detailed subsurface maps, like sonar, but through solid Earth. Can they detect us with that? May looked concerned. Not specifically as humans, but they can identify cavities, tunnels, any structural anomalies underground, including this facility. We needed to move immediately. I led the way into the utility tunnel, heading westward away from the converging patrol craft. Behind us, the resonance mapping continued, the pulses growing stronger as they focused on the area around the pump station. The tunnel extended for several miles before connecting to another natural cave system. As we moved through these passages, I noticed increasing signs of the alien transformation. Crystalline growths emerging from the rock, strange luminescence in previously dark chambers, alteration of mineral compositions. The process is accelerating even faster underground, May observed, checking her sensors, almost like they're deliberately targeting subsurface structures now. That aligned with my theory. If they were using radiation to catalyze molecular changes, they would need to ensure those changes penetrated beneath the surface. The resonance mapping wasn't just looking for survivors, it was identifying underground structures that needed to be transformed. We continued through increasingly alien passages, the familiar geology of Earth caves giving way to something else entirely. Crystalline formations grew more prevalent, emitting their own light that made our headlamps unnecessary in some chambers. The air grew thinner, with the same electrical quality we'd experienced on the surface. After several hours of difficult progress, we reached a massive chamber unlike anything I'd seen before. The cave ceiling soared hundreds of feet overhead, while the floor dropped away into depths we couldn't see. Spanning this chasm was a structure that couldn't possibly be natural, a bridge-like formation of crystalline material that pulsed with inner light. "They've been here," Tom stated unnecessarily. "Transformed this entire chamber." "Not just transformed," I corrected, examining the structure. "Created. This is deliberate construction, not just environmental modification." The bridge provided the only visible path across the chasm. We had no choice but to use it if we wanted to continue westward. But crossing an alien structure of unknown properties carried obvious risks. I examined the crystalline material carefully, assessing its structural properties. It appears stable. The internal energy patterns suggest a form of self-reinforcement, almost like active load balancing in modern bridge design, but integrated into the material itself. "Is it safe to cross?" May asked directly. I couldn't offer absolute certainty. From a structural engineering perspective, yes. It's designed to support weight, but I can't speak to other properties it might have. Tom made the decision. "We go one at a time. I'll cross first." He stepped onto the bridge cautiously. The crystalline material responded to his weight, subtle patterns of light flowing toward his contact points. But the structure remained stable, showing no signs of stress or failure. Tom continued across, moving steadily but carefully. When he reached the other side safely, May went next, experiencing the same response from the material, but no adverse effects. I followed last, my engineer's mind analyzing the structure as I crossed. The bridge was a remarkable feat of integrated design, simultaneously biological, technological, and architectural. It adapted to pressure dynamically, redistributing stress in real time. The principles were recognizable from advanced engineering concepts, but the implementation was far beyond current human capabilities. Once reunited on the far side, we continued through passages that showed increasing signs of alien modification. The natural cave system had been expanded and restructured with crystalline reinforcements and integrated energy conduits that seemed to serve as both structural support and information network. "They're building something down here," Tom observed, "not just changing the environment, but constructing infrastructure." "Converting our underground spaces to serve their purposes," I agreed, "just like they're doing on the surface with our existing infrastructure." We followed these modified passages for several more hours, eventually reaching what appeared to be a junction point between the alien-modified caves and a human-made tunnel, specifically an abandoned mine shaft that showed minimal signs of transformation. "This is promising," I noted, examining the boundary between the transformed and untransformed sections. "The alien modifications diminish significantly here. Something about this mine is resistant to their process." The mine shaft was older than the limestone complex our survivors occupied, probably early 20th century, judging by the timber supports and narrow-gauge rail system. As we moved deeper into it, the signs of alien influence disappeared entirely. "What is this place?" May asked, examining the rock walls with her sensors. I checked the geological composition. Granite mine. They were extracting building stone, probably for monuments or government buildings. "Why would granite resist their transformation?" Tom wondered. The answer came to me as I analyzed the stone's properties. Radiation shielding. Granite has high natural radiation levels from uranium and thorium content. Paradoxically, it also provides excellent shielding against certain types of radiation. This supported my theory. If the aliens were using radiation in specific ways to catalyze their transformation process, materials with complex radiation properties might disrupt that process or alter it in unpredictable ways. The granite mine provided safer passage for several miles before connecting to a more modern tunnel, what appeared to be an abandoned military installation from the Cold War era. The reinforced concrete walls bore faded government markings and radiation warning symbols. "We're getting close," Tom said, recognizing the military construction techniques. "This could connect to the bunker system May detected in the radio transmissions." As we moved through the military tunnel, signs of human activity became more recent. Fresh tool marks on doors, modern security systems, inactive but not decades old, supply caches that couldn't have been there more than a few weeks. Then, rounding a corner, we came face to face with what we'd been seeking and dreading. A heavily armed military checkpoint blocking the tunnel ahead. Spotlights immediately illuminated us, and multiple weapons were aimed in our direction. "Halt and identify," a voice commanded through a speaker system. "This is a secure military zone under United States Strategic Command Authority." We raised our hands slowly, showing we weren't a threat. Tom spoke, using his military background. "Civilians seeking assistance. We have critical intelligence about the alien presence and terraforming operations." There was a pause, then. "Approach slowly for radiation and contamination scanning. Any sudden movements will be considered hostile action." We moved forward carefully. Beyond the barricade, I could see what appeared to be a substantial military presence, not just a checkpoint but the edge of a significant installation. Perhaps we had found what we were looking for, the resources and organization necessary to effectively fight back against the alien transformation of our world. But as we approached the scanning equipment, I couldn't help wondering if we were already too late. The alien terraforming was accelerating, pushing toward some threshold beyond which Earth would no longer support human life. The military might have weapons, infrastructure, and personnel, but did they understand what they were facing? Did they have the scientific knowledge necessary to counter a process that was changing the fundamental chemistry of our planet? We were about to find out. The military checkpoint was just the outer perimeter of a much larger installation. After we were scanned for radiation and biological contamination, armed personnel escorted us deeper into the facility. The tunnels transitioned from old mining operations to modern military construction. Reinforced concrete, steel blast doors, advanced air filtration systems. We were brought to a decontamination chamber where we surrendered our equipment for inspection and underwent a more thorough scanning process. After being cleared, we were provided with clean jumpsuits and led to a briefing room. "Wait here," our escort instructed before leaving us alone in the room. The space was utilitarian: metal table, chairs, whiteboard, military insignia on the wall. Through a small window in the door, I could see personnel moving with purpose in the corridor outside. This wasn't a hastily established refugee center. This was a fully operational military command post. After about 20 minutes, the door opened, and a woman in a colonel's uniform entered, followed by 2 aides. Her name tape read Winters. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, but also showed signs of the strain everyone was under. Dark circles under her eyes, tension in her movements. "I'm Colonel Winters, commanding this facility," she introduced herself briskly. "I understand you have intelligence about the alien presence." Tom took the lead, explaining our journey from the dam to the limestone mines, our observations of the alien terraforming process, and our theories about their technology and methods. I added details about the structural patterns of their network and my analysis of their engineering approach. May described our interference experiments and what we'd learned about their communication systems. Colonel Winters listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions or having her aides make notes. When we finished our overview, she studied us thoughtfully. "Your observations align with our intelligence," she finally said. "But you've provided valuable new details, particularly regarding their network structure and radiation utilization." She activated a wall screen that displayed a map of the United States. Red areas indicated confirmed alien presence, yellow showed suspected activity, and green marked secure human zones. Most of the country was red or yellow, with only a few scattered green areas, primarily in mountainous regions or remote locations. "We're coordinating with surviving military and government elements nationwide," she explained. "This facility is one of several command nodes established in the Black Hills complex. We have approximately 2,000 military personnel and 800 civilians in this sector alone." This was more organized resistance than I had dared hope for. "What about countermeasures?" I asked. "Have you developed effective methods against their technology?" Colonel Winters' expression tightened. "Limited success. Conventional weapons are ineffective against their larger craft. Nuclear options are off the table. They appear to absorb and utilize radiation, as you observed. We've had some success with EMP weapons disrupting their smaller automated units, but the effects are temporary." "What about their terraforming process?" May inquired. "Have you found ways to slow or reverse the environmental changes?" "Not yet. Our scientists are working on it, but the transformation is accelerating. According to our latest atmospheric readings, we have less than 72 hours before surface conditions become lethal to humans without specialized equipment. The timeline was even shorter than we had estimated. The process was accelerating exponentially. We need to discuss your theory about their radiation utilization, Colonel Winters continued, looking at me. It aligns with some of our findings. Our facility contains a research division working on this specific question. I'd like you to brief them directly. I nodded, though I wondered what insights I could offer that their scientists hadn't already considered. I was an engineer, not a physicist or biologist. Colonel Winters instructed her aides to arrange quarters for us and scheduled a research briefing for 1 hour later. In the meantime, she suggested we rest and recover from our journey. Our temporary quarters were Spartan but comfortable. Military bunks, clean facilities, and our first hot meals since before the nuclear strikes. The normality of it felt almost surreal after what we'd experienced. An hour later, we were escorted to the research division of the complex. The atmosphere changed noticeably. Less military precision, more scientific intensity. Laboratories filled with equipment lined the corridors, with personnel in lab coats moving between workstations. We were brought to a conference room where several scientists were waiting. The lead researcher introduced himself as Dr. Harris, a nuclear physicist who had been working at a national laboratory when the attacks began. "Colonel Winters briefed me on your observations," he began without preamble, "particularly your theory about how the aliens are utilizing radiation. I'd like to hear more details." I explained my analysis, how the aliens seem to be harvesting radiation, using it to catalyze molecular changes in Earth's environment, accelerating the process in areas with higher radiation levels. "We've observed the same patterns, Doctor," Harris confirmed, "but we've discovered something else. They're not just using the radiation as a power source. They're using it to alter fundamental atomic interactions." He brought up a molecular model on a display screen. "This is normal Earth chemistry, the standard atomic bonding patterns that define our environment. And this," he switched to another model, "is what we're seeing in transformed areas. The electron shell configurations are being systematically altered, creating new bonding possibilities that shouldn't be stable under Earth conditions." This was beyond my expertise, but I grasped the implications. They're rewriting the basic rules of chemistry on our planet. Exactly. Not completely. The fundamental laws of physics remain, but they're shifting the equilibrium to favor their biochemistry over ours, like changing the temperature and pressure in a chemical reaction to produce different outcomes. May looked thoughtful. "And radiation is their catalyst for this process?" "Yes, but in a very specific way," Dr. Harris explained. "They're using precisely controlled radiation frequencies to excite particular electron transitions. It's incredibly sophisticated, beyond anything in our current technology." I considered this information in light of my structural observations. That explains the geometric precision of their network. They're creating a radiation control grid, each node calibrated to produce specific effects in its local environment, with the entire network working in concert to transform the planet systematically. Dr. Harris nodded. "That's our conclusion as well. The question is how to disrupt it effectively. Your interference experiments showed temporary effects, but the system quickly adapts. What about materials that naturally disrupt their process?" I asked, thinking about the granite mine and limestone formations. We noticed their transformation is less effective in certain geological environments. This caught Dr. Harris's attention. "We've observed similar patterns. Materials with complex radiation properties, certain minerals, specific metal alloys, seem to resist or alter the transformation process." A female scientist who had been quietly taking notes spoke up. "We've been experimenting with engineered materials that might interfere with their electron excitation patterns, crystalline structures doped with specific isotopes that create interference in the frequency ranges they're utilizing." Dr. Harris introduced her as Dr. Chen. No relation to the Chen in our survivor group, just a coincidence of names. She was a materials scientist who specialized in radiation interactions with advanced composites. "The challenge," Dr. Chen continued, "is delivery. Creating these materials in laboratory conditions is one thing. Deploying them effectively against a planetary-scale transformation is quite another." This was where my engineering background might actually be useful. You need to target critical nodes in their network. Not just any nodes, but specific ones that serve as stability anchors in their geometric pattern. I explained my fractal analysis of their network structure, how certain nodes served as harmonic anchors that stabilized the entire system. Disrupt those simultaneously with your specialized materials, and you might create cascading instability throughout the network. The scientists exchanged looks. That's actually consistent with our theoretical models, Dr. Harris acknowledged. We hadn't identified specific target nodes, but the mathematics of cascading network failures supports your approach. For the next several hours, we collaborated with the research team, combining their scientific understanding with our field observations. My structural analysis of the alien network, May's insights about their communication systems, and Tom's tactical expertise all contributed to developing a potential countermeasure. The plan that emerged was ambitious, but theoretically sound. The military had access to advanced delivery systems, including stealth drones designed to operate in contested airspace. We would equip these drones with payloads of engineered materials designed to disrupt the aliens' electron excitation processes. Then, using my fractal analysis, we would target specific stability nodes in their network simultaneously. If successful, the disruption wouldn't just be temporary, it would create fundamental instability in their transformation process, potentially forcing them to recalibrate their entire approach. Colonel Winters joined us as the plan took shape. "How quickly can we implement this?" she asked Dr. Harris. "The material synthesis is the limiting factor. We have the necessary isotopes, but creating the crystalline matrix with precise molecular alignment takes time. With our current equipment, perhaps 24 hours for sufficient quantities." "We don't have 24 hours, I pointed out. "The atmospheric transformation is accelerating. By then, surface operations might be impossible without specialized equipment." "We have environmental suits," Colonel Winters countered. "Not many, but enough for the drone deployment teams." Dr. Chen looked troubled. "There's another concern. Our simulations suggest that disrupting their process could have unpredictable side effects. The transformation has already progressed significantly. Destabilizing it might release enormous energy, potentially causing localized destructive events." "You mean explosions?" Tom asked bluntly. "More complex than that," Dr. Chen explained. "Think of it as rapidly shifting chemical equilibria across large areas. Some regions might experience sudden temperature changes, radiation spikes, or atmospheric composition fluctuations. We can't predict exactly what would happen." Colonel Winters absorbed this information with the calculated assessment of a military commander. Compared to the alternative, complete transformation of Earth's environment to something that can't support human life, these risks are acceptable. No one disagreed. The stakes were clear. Either we disrupted the alien terraforming process, with all the unpredictable consequences that might entail, or we accepted the extinction of humanity on Earth. The next 12 hours were a blur of activity. I worked with the scientific team to refine my fractal analysis, identifying the most critical stability nodes in the alien network based on both mathematical models and our field observations. May collaborated with communication specialists to develop targeting systems for the stealth drones. Tom joined the tactical planning team, helping design the deployment strategy to minimize detection before the payloads were delivered. Throughout this process, I was struck by the hybrid nature of our approach, combining military precision, scientific innovation, and the practical experience of survivors who had observed the aliens firsthand. It represented the best of human adaptability, our capacity to improvise and collaborate when faced with existential threats. Dr. Harris's team worked continuously on synthesizing the specialized materials for our payloads. The process involved precision control of crystalline growth under carefully maintained radiation conditions. I understood the basic principles but was impressed by the sophistication of their approach. Each crystal is essentially a tuned circuit, Dr. Chen explained as she showed me the first completed samples. designed to resonate at specific frequencies that interfere with the aliens' electron excitation patterns. When exposed to their energy fields, these materials should create disruptive interference cascades. The crystals themselves were beautiful, complex geometric structures with an iridescent quality that shifted as you moved them in the light. Hard to believe something so delicate-looking could potentially disrupt a planetary-scale alien terraforming operation. As the material synthesis continued, Colonel Winters called a briefing for all key personnel involved in the operation. The command center was crowded with military officers, scientists, engineers, and our small team of survivors. Operation Harmony Disruption will commence in 6 hours, she announced, using the code name that had been assigned to our plan. Primary objective: simultaneous disruption of 5 critical stability nodes in the alien transformation network. Secondary objective: observation of central hub response to assess effectiveness and gather intelligence for potential follow-up operations. Maps and tactical displays showed the target locations. 5 nodes positioned in a pentagonal formation around the central hub over Minneapolis. These weren't the largest or most obvious nodes, but according to my fractal analysis, they were critically important to maintaining stability across the entire network. Delivery will be via stealth drone aircraft, the tactical officer explained. Each drone carrying a payload of specially engineered disruptive materials. Drones will approach from multiple vectors, maintaining low altitude to minimize detection probability. Simultaneous payload delivery is essential for maximum effectiveness. The briefing continued with details of launch procedures, communications protocols, contingency plans. Throughout it all, I kept thinking about the structural elegance of the alien network, how its very precision and mathematical perfection might be its greatest vulnerability. In engineering, the most optimized systems are often the least resilient to unexpected disruptions. After the briefing, Colonel Winters approached our group privately. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. "We've received reports from other survivor enclaves about increased alien activity in the past 6 hours. They seem to be accelerating their timeline even further." "Why?" Tom asked. "Did they detect our preparations?" "Unlikely. This appears to be happening globally, not just in our region. Something has triggered a phase shift in their operation." I thought about the alien we had observed interfacing directly with the ground station. They're personally supervising now, moving from automated processes to direct intervention. Colonel Winters nodded. "That's our assessment as well, which means our window for effective action is closing rapidly." She hesitated, then continued. "There's another factor. Our long-range sensors detected new objects entering Earth's atmosphere 3 hours ago. Much larger than anything we've seen so far. They're positioning themselves in high orbit." "Reinforcements?" May suggested. "Or the next phase of their operation," I countered, thinking through the engineering sequence. If the current transformation is just site preparation, these new arrivals might represent the primary construction phase. The implications were clear. Our disruptive operation wasn't just urgent, it might be the last opportunity to act before the transformation became irreversible. As launch time approached, final preparations intensified. The synthesized crystal payloads were carefully loaded into the stealth drones. Targeting systems were calibrated based on the latest surveillance data. Communication protocols were established for the deployment teams. I found myself in an observation room with May and Tom, watching as the military personnel executed the operation with practiced efficiency. Despite everything we had been through, it felt strange to be on the sidelines for this crucial moment. "Should we be doing more?" Tom asked, echoing my thoughts. "We've done our part," May replied. "Provided the intelligence, the analysis, the targeting strategy. This part requires their expertise and equipment. She was right, of course, but after days of taking direct action, making decisions that determined our survival, it was difficult to simply watch others implement our plan. The launch countdown began. 5 stealth drones, each heading toward a different target node. The operations officer narrated their progress. Drone 1 airborne, proceeding to target Alpha. Drone 2 airborne, proceeding to target Bravo. Drone 3 airborne, proceeding to target Charlie, and so on until all 5 were deployed. The control room fell into focused silence as the drones made their approach. On tracking displays, we could see their progress, small icons moving toward the 5 target locations surrounding Minneapolis. The aliens had established defensive measures around their major nodes, but our targets were selected partly because they appeared less significant and thus potentially less defended. The stealth technology of the drones provided additional protection against detection. Drone 1 entering target perimeter. No reaction detected. Drone 2 entering target perimeter, proceeding as planned. Drone 3 encountering increased energy readings but no direct response. So far, so good. The drones were penetrating the alien-controlled zones without triggering immediate defensive responses. But the most dangerous part was still ahead, the final approach and payload delivery. All drones in final approach phase, synchronizing for simultaneous delivery. This was the critical moment. The payloads needed to be delivered within seconds of each other to create the cascading instability we were aiming for. If the timing was off, or if some drones were intercepted before delivery, the effect would be diminished or negated entirely. Synchronization complete. Payload delivery in 3, 2, 1, mark. On the main display, 5 points of light flashed simultaneously as the drones released their crystal payloads directly onto the target nodes. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, energy readings from the nodes began to fluctuate wildly. Energy pattern disruption confirmed at all 5 targets, the sensor officer reported. Resonance frequencies destabilizing. On the displays, we could see the effects spreading outward from each target, creating interference patterns where they intersected. The precise mathematical harmony of the alien network was being replaced by chaotic, conflicting energy signatures. Central hub responding, another officer called out. Massive energy surge detected. They're trying to stabilize the network. This was expected. The aliens would attempt to compensate for the disruption, redistributing energy to maintain their transformation process. But if our analysis was correct, the specific nodes we had targeted would make this compensation increasingly difficult as the instability spread. For several tense minutes, we watched as the aliens fought to regain control of their network. Energy patterns shifted, surged, and reconfigured across the displays. Then, something unexpected happened. New energy signature detected, the sensor officer reported, surprise evident in his voice, emanating from the central hub. Nothing we've seen before. The display showed a massive energy pulse erupting from the central structure over Minneapolis, expanding outward in concentric rings. As it reached each node in the network, including our targeted ones, the energy patterns changed again, not stabilizing as the aliens had intended, but transforming into something new. "What's happening?" Colonel Winters demanded. Dr. Harris was studying the readings intently. "They're implementing some kind of emergency protocol, not just trying to stabilize the network, but fundamentally altering its operational parameters." "Is that good or bad for us?" Tom asked the question we were all thinking. "Unknown," Dr. Harris admitted. "This is beyond our models. They're adapting in ways we didn't anticipate." As we watched, the energy pulse continued expanding outward, reaching more distant nodes and changing the pattern of the entire network. The transformation wasn't being reversed as we had hoped, but it was changing in unpredictable ways. Atmospheric readings shifting, an environmental officer reported. The composition changes are slowing in some regions, accelerating in others. The pattern is becoming more localized rather than global. Dr. Chen studied the data. They're consolidating, she realized. Instead of transforming the entire planet simultaneously, they're focusing on specific regions, creating fully transformed zones while leaving others temporarily untouched. This wasn't the outcome we had planned for, but it represented a significant change in the aliens' approach, a forced adaptation that might buy humanity valuable time. Colonel Winters assessed the situation quickly. How long before they stabilize completely and resume global transformation? Difficult to say, Dr. Harris replied. Days, perhaps. Maybe longer if the disruption continues to propagate through their network. Then we have a window, Colonel Winters decided. Time to evacuate more survivors to protected zones, to develop more effective countermeasures, to better understand what we're facing. As the operation room continued monitoring the unfolding situation, I found myself considering the structural implications of what we were witnessing. The aliens had designed a perfect system, mathematically precise, optimally efficient. But that very perfection made it vulnerable to unexpected disruption. Like any optimized structure, it sacrificed adaptability for efficiency. We had exploited that vulnerability, forcing them to abandon their optimal approach for a less efficient alternative. It wasn't victory, not even close, but it was proof that they could be disrupted, that their seemingly unstoppable transformation of our world had limitations and weaknesses. As I watched the continuing cascade of changes spreading through their network, I realized something else. This was just the beginning of a new phase in our struggle, not just for survival, but for the fundamental nature of Earth itself. The aliens were engineering our planet to suit their needs. We were now engaged in a counter-engineering effort to preserve what made it ours. It was a battle of structural principles, of system design philosophies. And while their technology far exceeded ours, we had something they might not, the desperate creativity that comes from fighting for your home. I turned to May and Tom. We need to get back to our group. Bring them here if possible. This facility has the resources to develop more effective countermeasures, but they need the perspectives of people who've observed the aliens directly. Colonel Winters overheard and nodded. Agreed. We'll organize an extraction team. If your people can make it to designated coordinates, we can bring them in safely. As plans formed for retrieving our survivor group from the limestone mines, I continued watching the displays showing the disrupted alien network. Something about the way they were adapting nagged at my engineer's instincts. A pattern I couldn't quite identify but felt was important. The aliens engineered systems with perfect mathematical precision. Their adaptation to our disruption would follow similar principles: optimized, efficient, predictable if you understood the underlying logic, which meant their next moves could be anticipated, countered before they were fully implemented. They thought like engineers. So did I. And in this strange new conflict for the future of Earth, that shared perspective might be one of humanity's most valuable assets. The battle for our world had entered a new phase. We had survived the nuclear fire and the initial alien onslaught. Now we were engaged in a more complex struggle, not just to survive, but to prevent the fundamental transformation of Earth itself. And as I stood there watching the cascading disruption spread through their perfect system, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the missiles launched. Hope, not certainty, not victory, just the faint, fragile possibility that humanity might yet find a way to preserve our world against an enemy that sought to remake it in their image. That possibility was enough. It had to be. We had survived the first 92 hours. Now we needed to survive what came next.